Sometimes the world presents us with a story so strange, so perfectly bizarre, that it feels like it must have a supernatural explanation. A voice from beyond the grave, a town-wide curse, a ghost reaching through a wall. These are the kinds of tales that make the hair on your arms stand up. But often, when you peel back the layers of the impossible, you don't find a ghost. You find something far more terrifying. A human being. Today we have three stories that all start in that strange, mysterious place, but end with a truth that is all too real and all too dark. Late on the night of the 26th of October 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was resting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio. The house was quiet, and she was just enjoying the peace before heading to bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. The first thing Ethel did was glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to 10:30. That was unusual. Very few people, if any, ever called her this late at night. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. A call at this hour usually meant bad news. She slowly got to her feet, walked over to the phone, and picked up the receiver. She said, "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a man's voice said back, "Hey sis." Ethel instantly recognized the voice. It wasn't one of her brothers, despite the familiar greeting. It was someone who was practically family, her husband Don's very best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. For decades, Lee had been their next-door neighbor. He and Don and Ethel were inseparable. They were at each other's houses almost every single day, sharing meals, helping with chores, just living life together. They were the kind of friends who become an extension of your own family. A few years back, Lee had moved to a different town, so they didn't see each other quite as often, but the bond was still just as strong. They still got together whenever they could, and Lee made a point to call regularly just to check in and see how they were doing. So, hearing Lee's voice wasn't a surprise. But the time of the call was still a bit odd. Ethel figured he was just calling for a late-night chat. But before she could even reply to his greeting, before she could ask why he was calling so late, Lee just kept talking. It was strange. It was like he wasn't having a conversation with her, but was just delivering a message he had to get out. He spoke in a flat, hurried tone. He said, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like I've never felt this way before. I really need your husband, Don, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then, just like that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Ethel stood there, holding the silent receiver, completely bewildered. The whole call had lasted maybe 10 seconds. On one hand, it seemed like he was just checking in, but the words he used were serious, alarming. "I've never felt this way before. That's not something you say lightly." But there was something else. Something that made a chill run down her spine. How did Lee know that Dawn wasn't home? Her husband was out for the evening and wasn't due back for a little while. Lee had stated it as a fact, the moment he gets back. It was as if he was standing outside their window watching the house. But that was impossible. He lived in another town. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ethel tried to call him back immediately. The phone just rang and rang. No answer? She tried again a few minutes later, and then again. Still nothing. By the time her husband, Don, finally walked through the front door a little while later, Ethel was pacing with worry. She immediately told him about the strange call from Lee. She recounted the conversation word for word. She told him, "He said he wasn't feeling good, that he needed you to call him as soon as you got back. But Don, the weirdest part was how he knew you were out." Don was just as confused as she was. He said, "All right, that's weird." He took the phone from Ethel and dialed Lee's number himself. Again, it just rang unanswered. Now, Don was getting seriously concerned. He turned to Ethel and said, "Go over it again." What was his tone like? Did he sound like he was in pain? Was he scared? What exactly did he say? Ethel tried her best to describe it. She said, "I don't know, he just sounded distant. He just stated that he didn't feel good and had never felt this way before. And he was very specific that you needed to call him when you came back." I just don't understand it. They both stood there in the quiet house, a shared feeling of dread hanging in the air. They knew Lee well enough to know he wasn't one for drama. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, they decided they couldn't just sit there and wait. They had to do something. They decided to just drive to his house in the next town and check on him in person just to make sure he was okay. So they locked up their house, got in their car, and started the drive into the dark night. When they finally arrived at Lee's house, all the lights were off. The place was dark and still. His car wasn't in the driveway. A quick look through the windows confirmed he wasn't there. Now, their worry was turning into real fear. Even though it was late, they started knocking on the doors of his neighbors, hoping someone had seen him or knew where he might be. After a few doors with no luck, one neighbor finally gave them a piece of information. The neighbor said they had seen an ambulance at Lee's house earlier in the evening and believed he had been taken to the hospital. For Ethel and Dawn, this was confirmation of their worst fears. Something was seriously wrong with their friend. They thanked the neighbor and rushed back to their car, heading straight for the nearest hospital, a place called Mercy Hospital. When they arrived, they hurried into the emergency room and spoke to the front desk. They explained that they were looking for their friend, Lee Epps. The nurse checked her records and confirmed that yes, Lee had been admitted earlier that night. But then her expression shifted, and her voice softened. She told them that, unfortunately, Lee had passed away. The news was a devastating blow. They had been friends for most of their lives. The thought of him being gone so suddenly and unexpectedly was almost impossible to process. But the most shocking part of their discovery was yet to come. As they spoke with the medical staff trying to understand what had happened to him, Dawn asked a simple question. He asked what time Lee had passed away. A doctor looked at the chart and then looked back at them. He told Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 that night. The exact moment, the exact minute. His official time of death was the very same moment that the phone had rung in Ethel's living room. The same moment she had heard her friend's voice on the other end of the line, saying he had never felt this way before and that he needed to speak to his best friend one last time. Ethel and Dawn had no way to prove it, of course. It was just their word against the laws of physics. But for the rest of their lives, they firmly believed that the phone call they received that night wasn't from a telephone line. It was from somewhere else. It was Lee's spirit reaching across the veil to say goodbye. But a mysterious phone call is one thing. What was happening in a small village in rural China was something else entirely. It was a tragedy on a scale that was almost unimaginable. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma King Mao and several of his family members walked through the streets of their home, Luoan village. Luoan was, or at least it had been, a beautiful and historic place. As they walked, they passed lush green fields and could see majestic mountains rising in the distance. But the scenery was scarred. Interspersed with the beauty were the charred, skeletal remains of dozens of buildings. It was a constant, painful reminder of what their community had lost. Ma King Mao had lived in this village his entire life. He remembered a time when it was a happy, vibrant, tight-knit community of over 100 people. It was a truly picturesque place to live, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. But 3 years prior, everything had changed. Life in Luoan village had become a living nightmare, one disaster piling on top of another. It started with the fires. There hadn't been just one, but two enormous fires that had ripped through the village. The official cause was faulty wiring. These fires had destroyed homes, businesses, and priceless historic buildings. They had fundamentally changed the face of the town, and years later, the scars still hadn't healed. But as devastating as the fires were, it was what happened after the embers cooled that truly turned the village into a place of fear. For some unexplainable reason, the mortality rate in their small village suddenly skyrocketed. It seemed like every week someone else was just dropping dead. Healthy people, young people, it didn't matter. They would get sick suddenly and then pass away. The villagers became terrified. They started to believe that some kind of invisible plague had descended upon them, a curse they couldn't see or understand. The situation got so bad, with so many people dying, that China's Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, sent a team to conduct a full-blown investigation. They spent weeks in the village, testing, interviewing, and analyzing, but their conclusion was baffling. They announced that there was no connection between the deaths. They determined that everyone who had died had passed away from common illnesses or old age. They were all, according to the experts, natural deaths. It was just a tragic, statistical anomaly, an unfortunate spike in the mortality rate that just happened to follow the horrible fires. It was, they said, just a string of terrible coincidences. But many of the villagers, including Mocking Mao, simply didn't buy it. It felt wrong. It felt like something more was at play. They started to whisper that their village wasn't unlucky. It was cursed. And so, on this summer afternoon, Mocking Mao and his family walked past the burned-out shells of their old lives, making their way to the village temple. They were there for yet another funeral. This time, it was for a young woman from the village who had died just as inexplicably as all the others. According to the CDC, her death was from natural causes. But to the people who knew her, it made no sense at all. They filed into the temple, another cloud of grief hanging over their cursed home. Later that same night, Mocking Mao stumbled through the dark, quiet streets, heading back to his house. After the funeral, he and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for a ceremonial dinner, which was a local custom. His family had left right after the meal, but Mocking Mao, feeling particularly down about the state of his village, had stayed behind. He continued to eat and drink some alcohol, sharing stories and sorrows with his neighbors. Now, he was finally making his way home. But as he walked, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his stomach. It was so intense it nearly buckled his knees, making it incredibly difficult to walk. He clutched his abdomen, forcing himself to put one foot in front of the other, his house seeming miles away. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the latch and stumbled inside. The pain was so blinding, so all-consuming, that he could only scream out for help before collapsing onto the floor right in front of his horrified family. As he lay on the ground, he began to vomit uncontrollably. And then, just moments later, he passed away. His family could do nothing but watch in horror. Now, Mocking Mao wasn't a village leader or a person of great influence. He was just a man who had lived there his whole life, a man everyone knew and respected. But for some reason, his death felt different. It felt monumental. For the people of Luan village, it was the absolute final straw. When they heard the news, a collective feeling washed over the community. Enough is enough. There was no possible way that all these deaths were natural. They refused to accept that answer any longer. The village director, who was essentially the town's mayor, got on the phone with the provincial health department. He explained the entire situation, the fires, the string of deaths, the CDC's inconclusive findings, and the village's refusal to believe them. The health department agreed to look into it and sent a team of 20 experts to the village. They conducted another massive investigation, trying to find any link, anything that could explain what was happening. And after all their work, they came back with the exact same conclusion as the CDC. It was all natural. There was nothing to worry about. But the villagers were not worrying. They were terrified and angry. They went back to their director and demanded that he do something else. This was not an acceptable answer. And he agreed. He made one last call, this time to the local police. He asked them to come in and conduct their own investigation, to look at this not as a health crisis, but as a potential crime. He begged them to see if there was anything, any small detail that the scientists might have missed. And so, the police came to Luoan village. They didn't bring microscopes or testing kits. They brought a different perspective. They started a broad, sweeping investigation, and very quickly they found something. Something the health experts had completely overlooked. and what they discovered explained everything. It turned out the village had one doctor, a man named Ma Fuxing. But Ma was not a real doctor. His medical training consisted of reading a couple of medical books. That was it. He had no formal education, no license, no real idea of what he was doing. And yet, he was the only person the villagers could turn to when they had any medical issues. He directly benefited every time someone got sick because they would come to him and pay for his useless treatments. So you had a man, posing as a doctor, who likely made his patients even sicker, and he was profiting from their illness. That was bad enough. But it got so much worse. Ma Fuxing was also the owner of the village's only funeral home. So, if his fake medicine didn't work and you died, he profited from you again. Ma Fuxing had a complete monopoly on sickness and death in Luowan village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money was if you stayed healthy. For a while, Ma Fuxing was content to just let this system play out. He was a fake doctor and a funeral director, and business was steady enough. But eventually, he got greedy. He wanted more money. So he started secretly poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide. Suddenly, more people started getting sick. And more people started dying. And for every single one of them, Ma Fuxing collected a fee. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. And so he looked around the village and decided to create even more death and suffering. Those two massive fires, the ones that were officially ruled as being caused by faulty wiring, that wasn't faulty wiring. That was arson. Ma Fuxing had set the fires himself, burning people's homes and businesses to the ground, killing people in the process, all because he knew he had a monopoly on the aftermath. Every death was just more business for him. The police investigation unraveled his entire scheme. They re-examined the fire scenes and quickly determined it was arson. From there, they started asking the one question the health experts never did: who benefits? All roads led back to Ma Fuxing. In the end, they determined he was responsible for the deaths of 76 people. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life. His friends. He had systematically murdered 76 of them for profit. He was ultimately arrested, convicted of murder and arson, and sentenced to death. The curse on Luowan village wasn't supernatural. It was a man. It's hard to imagine a more evil person. But sometimes evil isn't a stranger poisoning a town from the shadows. Sometimes it's sleeping in the room right next to yours. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh was sitting at a large dining room table inside his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father for a family visit. They were staying with his aunt, a woman named Miss Blackwood, and also visiting with his 19-year-old cousin, a young woman named Ballen. Ballen was Miss Blackwood's ward. Her own parents had died 4 years earlier, leaving her an orphan, and the very wealthy Miss Blackwood had graciously taken her in. She had become Ballen's de facto mother. On this particular morning, Paul, his parents, and Ballen were all gathered for a luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared. They were chatting and enjoying the food, but they were all waiting for one person to join them, Miss Blackwood herself. And this wasn't just a formality out of respect for their host. They genuinely adored her. Paul's aunt was a wonderful woman, full of energy and life. She was fun, she was witty, and yes, she was very wealthy, and her house was magnificent. Family visits with Miss Blackwood were always something to look forward to. Her arrival downstairs was what would truly start the day. But as time stretched on, and Miss Blackwood still hadn't appeared, the family began to eat. They figured she was just sleeping in or taking her time getting ready, and they would see her soon enough. So they ate their food and made pleasant conversation, enjoying the nice morning. Suddenly, their peaceful breakfast was shattered. The housemaid, who had gone upstairs a few minutes earlier, came running back into the dining room. Her face was pale with panic, and she was clearly distraught. She cried out that Miss Blackwood was dead. For a moment, Paul was just completely confused. It didn't make any sense. Just the night before, his aunt had been her usual vibrant self. She had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. There was absolutely no sign that anything was wrong with her. But the family immediately rushed out of the dining room and followed the frantic housemaid up the grand staircase to Miss Blackwood's bedroom. They pushed open the door, and there she was. Paul's aunt was lying in her bed, still and silent. She was cold to the touch. She was gone. Later that morning, Paul and his heartbroken family sat in the living room with Miss Blackwood's regular family doctor. He had just come from examining her body upstairs. He sat down with them and explained that while there were no clear signs of illness or injury, Miss Blackwood was 70 years old and had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years prior. In his professional opinion, her heart had simply given out in her sleep. It was a peaceful end. For the most part, the family reacted with a mixture of profound sadness and reluctant acceptance. It was tragic, but it made sense. Paul felt the same way, logically. It was awful, he couldn't believe she was gone, but the doctor's explanation seemed plausible. And yet, underneath the logic, there was a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, he couldn't articulate why, but he had an immediate gut-wrenching sense that this was not the whole story. He felt that something else had happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions to himself. It felt inappropriate to start suggesting conspiracy theories just hours after his aunt had died, especially when there was a perfectly logical explanation right in front of them. So, he stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't go away. It just sat there in the pit of his stomach. After the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all stay at Miss Blackwood's house for the time being. There was so much to do. They had a funeral to plan, and they had to begin the complicated process of dealing with her will and her large estate. Since they had already planned to be there for a visit anyway, they decided to stay and help manage everything during this difficult transition. 5 weeks passed. Paul and his family were still living in Miss Blackwood's house. Sorting out her estate was proving to be a massive and complicated task, and it was taking much longer than anyone had anticipated. By this point, Paul's role in the legal and financial matters was minimal. He was mostly just there to provide emotional support for his parents as they navigated the complex paperwork. But secretly, Paul had taken on a mission of his own. He still hadn't told anyone about his persistent feeling that his aunt had been killed. He knew how crazy it sounded, especially since he had absolutely no evidence to support it other than that powerful gut feeling. But he hadn't been able to let it go. He had started his own quiet, secret investigation. His investigation had led him to a strange decision. He had started sleeping in his late aunt's bedroom. He had developed a belief that if he slept in her bed, in her room, then maybe her ghost would visit him. Maybe she would give him a sign, a clue, some kind of message that would tell him what really happened to her. For weeks, he had slept there every night, waiting. But he had seen nothing. No ghosts, no signs. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. On this particular night, 5 weeks to the day after his aunt's death, Paul was lying in her bed, getting ready to fall asleep. As he lay there in the darkness, he heard a strange sound coming from the side of the room. It was a faint, scraping noise, almost like scratching. The room was very dark, with only a little bit of moonlight filtering through the window. He opened his eyes and rolled over, peering into the shadows in the direction of the sound. At first, he couldn't see anything. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a hand. A disembodied hand connected to an arm was reaching out from the wall, stretching into the room in his direction. Now, Paul had obviously never seen anything like this before. Logically, he should have been terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, seeing a ghost. But he wasn't scared. A strange sense of calm and validation washed over him. He thought, this is it. It's working. My aunt is here. She's going to tell me what happened. This was the sign he had been waiting for. With absolutely no fear, Paul got out of the bed. He walked silently across the room towards the disembodied arm that was protruding from the wall. And then he reached out and grabbed it. The moment his hand closed around the arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It wasn't a ghostly wail, it was the very real shriek of a terrified person. The sound woke everyone up. Paul's father came running down the hall and burst into the bedroom. The sight that greeted him was baffling. He saw his son, Paul, standing in the middle of the room, holding onto an arm that was sticking out of a hole in the wall. It turned out there really was an arm reaching through the wall, but it wasn't a ghost. It belonged to a person who had everything to do with Miss Blackwood's death, because she did not die of heart disease. She was murdered. The person sleeping in the room next door had drilled a hole through the wall, a hole just big enough for an arm to pass through. And late at night, while Miss Blackwood was asleep, that person had reached through the hole and poured poison into the glass of water she always kept by her bedside. She had died in her sleep from the poison, and it had been mistaken for a heart attack. The killer was aware that Paul was suspicious. Even though Paul had kept his thoughts to himself, his actions, especially his insistence on sleeping in Miss Blackwood's room, had made the killer very nervous. It seemed like Paul was getting close to the truth. And so, the killer decided to get rid of him the same way they had gotten rid of his aunt. They waited for Paul to be asleep, saw the glass of water next to his bed, and reached through the hole to pour poison into it. But they hadn't counted on Paul being awake, waiting for a ghost. He heard the sound, saw the arm, and grabbed it, thinking he was making contact with the spirit world. In reality, he was catching his own would-be killer in the act. The screams were the sound of the killer, realizing they had been caught. And the killer was Paul's own 19-year-old cousin, Malene. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood had taken Malene in and treated her like her own daughter. She had even added Malene to her will, ensuring the girl would inherit a significant portion of her vast fortune. But Malene couldn't wait for her aunt to die of natural causes. She wanted the money now. And so she had murdered the woman who had saved her. Caught red-handed, Malene quickly confessed everything to Paul and his parents. They sent for the police to come and arrest her for the murder of Miss Blackwood and the attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could arrive, Malene suddenly began bleeding from her mouth. She collapsed onto the floor and died just minutes later. While it was never officially confirmed, it's widely believed that she used the very same poison she had used on her aunt to take her own life, choosing to die rather than face justice for her crimes. Every story tonight started with something that seemed supernatural. But in the end, the real horror wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was human greed. Because sometimes the darkest thing in this world isn't what hides in the shadows. It's what people are willing to do for money, power, or just a little bit more. Until next time. In March of 2015, in the sprawling, historic city of St. Petersburg, Russia, a 8-year-old woman named Tamara Samsonova was living in a state of controlled chaos. Her apartment, the place she had called home for years, was being torn apart and put back together. Renovations. Dust was everywhere, the noise was constant, and it was becoming nearly impossible to live there. A good friend of hers, a 9-year-old woman named Valentina Olenova, heard about Tamara's situation. Valentina lived nearby and had a spare room. She felt for her friend and decided to make a generous offer. She called up Tamara and said something along the lines of, "Why don't you come and stay with me while the work is getting done?" "It's no trouble at all." Tamara was immensely grateful. It was the perfect solution. She immediately accepted, packed a few bags, and moved into Valentina's quiet, comfortable apartment. From the moment she arrived, Tamara wanted to be the perfect houseguest. She knew she couldn't afford to pay rent, so she decided to contribute in other ways. She became the unofficial housekeeper. She cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, she did all the dishes, and she made sure there was always a home-cooked meal ready for Valentina. For the first couple of weeks, things were wonderful. The two women, both in their later years, enjoyed the companionship. They'd chat in the evenings, share meals, and it felt like a comfortable, easy arrangement. Valentina was happy to help her friend, and Tamara was relieved to be out of her noisy, dusty apartment. Then, after a few weeks passed, Tamara got a call. The renovations on her home were complete. It was time for her to move back. But a strange thing had happened. Tamara had gotten used to living with Valentina. She enjoyed the company, she enjoyed their routine, and frankly, she didn't want to leave. So she approached Valentina and asked, would it be okay if I stayed just a little bit longer? I'm really enjoying it here. Valentina was a little hesitant. The original agreement was just for the duration of the renovations. But she was a kind woman, and she didn't want to just kick her friend out onto the street. So she reluctantly agreed. Okay, she said. A little bit longer is fine. But a little bit longer turned into a couple of months. Spring turned into summer, and Tamara showed absolutely no signs of packing her bags or making any plans to move back to her own apartment. Valentina's patience began to wear thin. Her home didn't feel like her own anymore. The temporary guest had become a permanent fixture, and the initial harmony had curdled into a quiet, simmering resentment. Valentina started dropping hints, asking about Tamara's apartment, wondering aloud when she might be moving back. But Tamara would just brush off the questions or change the subject. Finally, in late July of 2015, Valentina couldn't take it anymore. She decided a direct confrontation was the only way. She sat Tamara down and told her straight up, you have to go. The renovations are done. It's time for you to go home. She expected some resistance, maybe some sadness, but she didn't expect Tamara's flat-out refusal. Tamara just looked at her and said, no, I'm not leaving. This sparked a huge fight. Voices were raised, feelings were hurt, and the tension in the small apartment became unbearable. But at the end of it all, nothing was resolved. Tamara still refused to leave. For the next couple of days, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the apartment. The two women moved around each other like ghosts, not speaking, not even making eye contact. The air was thick with unspoken anger. This Cold War was finally broken on July 23rd over something incredibly trivial. There were a few unwashed cups left in the sink. One of them was supposed to have cleaned them, but hadn't. An argument started about whose turn it was to do the dishes. But of course, it wasn't really about the cups. It was about everything else. The argument quickly escalated, and soon, Valentina was screaming at Tamara again. You shouldn't even be here. You need to leave my home! And Tamara was yelling back, no, I'm not going to leave. It was another huge blowout fight filled with bitterness and frustration. But then, something shifted. As the yelling died down, Tamara's demeanor changed. She seemed to finally accept the situation. With a sigh of resignation, she looked at Valentina and said, okay, I get it. I need to leave. Just give me a couple of days to get my things in order and I'll be out of your hair. Instantly, all the tension just evaporated from the room. Valentina felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, she was going to get her apartment back. The fighting was over. To seal the truce, Tamara offered a peace offering. Look, she said, I'll make us a special dinner tonight. I'll go out and get the food. Tamara left the apartment, but she didn't go straight to the grocery store. Her first stop was a local pharmacy. She walked in and bought a large quantity of potent sleeping pills. Then she went to the market and bought all the ingredients for a traditional Russian Olivier salad, a dish she knew was one of Valentina's absolute favorites. She returned to the apartment and began to prepare the meal. The kitchen was quiet as she chopped vegetables, but her mind was anything but. She took the sleeping pills she had just purchased, and using a mortar and pestle, she crushed them into a fine white powder. Then, as she was mixing the mayonnaise-based dressing for the salad, she carefully stirred the powder in, making sure it was completely dissolved and undetectable. She served the dinner, and Valentina, hungry and happy that their conflict was resolved, ate the entire salad. She didn't notice anything wrong. The dressing was rich and creamy, just the way she liked it. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had finished every last bite, she simply cleared the plates, went up to her room, and went to bed, leaving her friend in the living room. She waited. A couple of hours later, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Tamara quietly got out of bed. She crept downstairs to the kitchen. And there, on the floor, was Valentina, passed out cold. Tamara walked over and checked for a pulse. She was still breathing. For a moment, Tamara felt a flash of disappointment. She had hoped the massive overdose of sleeping pills would have been enough to kill her. But it didn't really matter. It just changed the next step of her plan. She went to a closet where she had stashed a hacksaw. She had borrowed it from a neighbor earlier that day under the pretense of needing it for a small project. Now, she brought it back to the kitchen. Standing over her unconscious friend, Tamara began the gruesome, laborious task of dismembering Valentina's body. She worked with a strange, methodical precision. As she cut her friend into pieces, she took special care to remove the lungs, making sure not to damage them. It turns out, human lungs were a particular delicacy for Tamara. She considered them her favorite food. Once the body was in several pieces, she took Valentina's head and placed it into a large stock pot on the stove. She filled it with water and turned on the burner, beginning to boil it. While the head and the carefully preserved lungs cooked, she took the rest of Valentina's remains. She cut them into the smallest pieces she could manage, then wrapped them in a shower curtain and stuffed them into various plastic bags. The process was long and physically demanding, but Tamara worked tirelessly through the early morning hours. With Valentina's head and lungs simmering on the stovetop, Tamara began the disposal. She started making trips, dozens of them, from the apartment speed down the stairs and out the front door into the dark, silent streets of St. Petersburg. She carried the heavy bags one by one all the way down to a small lake near their apartment building where she tossed them into the dark water. Back and forth she went, trip after trip, until most of the body parts were gone. Valentina's hips and legs, however, were apparently too heavy for her to carry all the way to the lake. So, for those, she took a different route, dragging them to a nearby patch of forest and leaving them there. Her final trip was perhaps the most macabre. She carried the big silver pot from the stove. Inside was what was left of Valentina's head, after Tamara had finished eating most of it. 4 days passed. Life in the apartment building went on as normal. Then, on July 27th, a young couple who lived in the same building as Tamara and Valentina decided to take their dog for a walk near the lake. As they strolled along the path, their dog suddenly took off running. It stopped in front of a large, bulky plastic bag that had washed up near the shore. The dog began sniffing and pawing at the bag, trying to get it open. The couple called for their dog, but it wouldn't budge. It was completely fixated on the mysterious package. Annoyed, the owners walked over to see what had captured their pet's attention. The man poked the bag with his foot. It was heavy, and it felt wrong. With a sense of dread, he managed to tear it open. Inside, they found a human torso. It was Valentina's. When the police arrived, one of the first things they did was canvass the apartment building to see if anyone was missing. They quickly learned that the victim was likely Valentina Olenova. They went to her apartment to investigate and were surprised to find Tamara Samsonova living there. They approached her gently, assuming she was a grieving friend or relative. They explained that Valentina had been found deceased and that they needed to search the apartment as part of the investigation. Tamara's reaction was completely bizarre. She was totally indifferent. There was no sadness, no shock, no fear. She just calmly allowed them in, as if she knew this day would eventually come. The search of the apartment didn't take long. The officers quickly found what they were looking for. There were specks of blood all over the bathroom. There was more blood in the kitchen. They found the hacksaw she had used, still bearing traces of blood and tissue. And then they found her diary. It was sitting on a table right next to a book about black magic and the occult. When the police opened the diary, they were horrified. It wasn't just a daily journal. It was a meticulous, detailed log of ritualistic killings that Tamara had apparently been carrying out for the past 20 years. The diary described 14 different murders. According to her own writings, almost all of the killings were motivated by her desire to cast spells she was learning from her books on black magic. These spells, she wrote, required specific human components like flesh or organs. So she would kill people, use their bodies for her rituals, and then afterwards she would consume parts of them. Not because the spell required it, but simply because she said she liked the taste of human flesh. And in particular, she noted, she loved the taste of human lungs. The police arrested Tamra on the spot. She didn't put up a fight. She didn't deny anything. She looked at the officers and said, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." During her trial, Tamara's behavior was a spectacle. She seemed to be in a great mood, often smiling. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to the reporters in the courtroom gallery. It was as if she was completely detached from the reality of her horrific crimes, or perhaps she simply didn't care anymore. Tamara, who the press quickly nicknamed the Granny Ripper, was found guilty and given a life sentence. To this day, she remains in a high-security prison, one of Russia's most notorious and chilling serial killers. After spending 21 years serving in the U.S. Army, a man retired and decided to move his family to Central Florida. He, his wife, and their young son settled into a quiet life. They had plenty of money. He had his military pension coming in every month, and his wife still worked a full-time job. But after a lifetime of structure and activity in the military, he found retirement to be incredibly boring. He just wasn't the type to sit around the house all day. So, he decided he needed to find a simple job, something to keep him occupied and give him a reason to get out of the house. He ended up taking a job as a clerk at a gas station located right off a major highway. One of the main reasons he chose this particular job was because the owners were very laid back. They didn't mind if his son came to hang out with him during his shifts. So, for years, that became their routine. The man would work his shifts behind the cash register, and his son would tag along. Even as the boy grew into a teenager, when you'd think he'd want to be off with his friends, he still came along. The town they lived in was so small and quiet, there was really nothing else for him to do. So even well into his teenage years, the son would spend his evenings at the gas station with his dad. One night in 1990, the son, who was 15 years old at the time, was taking a break. He was sitting outside at a picnic table under the bright lights of the gas station's canopy. He was reading a magazine and drinking a Mountain Dew. It was a dark, quiet night. There were no cars at the pumps, no customers inside the store, and the highway itself was mostly empty. It was in this stillness that he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, a woman, was walking off the shoulder of the highway, heading directly toward the gas station. This immediately struck him as odd. He thought to himself, "No one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here." His logical conclusion was that her car must have broken down nearby, and she was coming to use their payphone to call for a tow truck. The woman continued walking across the large, empty parking lot, getting closer and closer. The boy had turned his attention back to his magazine for a moment, but he would say later that he kept looking up, keeping an eye on her. There was just something about her, something that felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The woman walked right past the picnic table where he was sitting, not even acknowledging him. She didn't say hi, didn't make eye contact, just walked straight to the glass door and went inside the convenience store. From where the boy was sitting, the front of the store was all glass windows, so he had a clear view inside. He could see his father standing behind the counter, and he could see the top of the woman's head as she began to walk up and down the aisles. As soon as she was inside, the boy put his magazine down and just watched. He noticed she wasn't really shopping. She would walk down an aisle, look down at the shelves for a few seconds, but never pick anything up. Then she would look up towards the counter and just stare at his father for a moment before looking back down and moving to the next aisle. She did this over and over, circling the small store. At some point, the woman seemed to abandon this pretense of shopping and just walked directly up to the counter. There was still nobody else in the store, and the night was so quiet that the boy could fairly clearly hear her conversation with his father. He heard her tell his dad that her car had broken down and she needed a ride. Could he drive her to Ocala? That was the next big town north of their gas station. The boy would say later that his father's reaction was very strange. Normally, his dad was incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He was chatty and friendly with everyone who came in. But with this woman, his dad's tone was dismissive, almost rude. When she asked for a ride, he just gave a short, flat answer. No, I won't give you a ride. The woman was visibly annoyed by how quickly he had shut her down. But instead of just taking no for an answer, she did something strange. She turned and looked out the window, directly at the boy sitting on the picnic bench. He was looking right back at her. She pointed at the boy and said to his father, "What about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride?" The boy saw his father, who was out of the woman's direct line of sight, look at him and shake his head no very firmly. It was a clear signal. Whatever she wants from you, you say no. The boy was confused by all this. He was still trying to understand why his dad was being so hostile and unhelpful. The woman clearly needed help, or at least she claimed to. But he trusted his dad's judgment. He knew that if she came outside and asked him directly, he would say no. But it never came to that. The boy's father said to the woman in a firm, final tone, "No, my son is not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you." The woman exploded in a fit of rage. She started cussing him out, screaming at him. She stormed towards the door, slammed it open, and stalked back out into the parking lot. She started cussing at the boy as she passed him. The whole time she was walking away, back towards the dark highway, she kept turning around, flipping them both off and screaming profanities. The father had come out from behind the counter and was now standing next to his son, watching her go. As she disappeared into the darkness, the boy turned to his dad and asked, what was her deal? Why did you not want to help her? The dad just shook his head. I don't know, he said. There was just something off about her. I can't explain it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I just knew she had to go. They didn't talk about it much after that. It was just a weird, uncomfortable encounter on an otherwise normal night. A year went by. The boy was in his room at home one evening when he heard his dad yelling from the living room, a sense of urgency in his voice. Come in here. You have to see this. Look at the TV. The boy ran into the living room, and on the television screen, there was a news report. And on the screen was a mugshot. It was the same woman from the gas station. Her name, the reporter said, was Aileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who targeted men she met along the highways of Florida. The news report detailed how she would get her male victims to pick her up, often at gas stations, before robbing and killing them. The boy and his father stood there, staring at the screen in stunned silence. The chilling realization washed over them. It's unclear if the boy or his father were intended to be her next victims that night. But by the time she had walked into their gas station, she had already killed 4 men. And following that strange, tense interaction with them, she had gone on to kill 3 more people. One of those victims was found in Ocala, Florida, the very town she had asked them for a ride to. Aileen had been caught, which is why her face was on the news. She was later sentenced to death for her crimes. The boy and his father never forgot that night, the night a serial killer walked into their lives, and a father's unexplainable gut feeling may have saved them both. In the early evening of the 7th of May, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zvonka Telemakaska was in the kitchen of her small apartment in Kisevo, a quiet city in the southeastern European nation of North Macedonia. Kisevo is a peaceful place, nestled at the base of a huge mountain. It's beautiful, but also very remote. It's the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, and nothing of real note ever seems to happen. Zvonka worked as a cleaning lady to make ends meet. But on this particular day, she had the day off. She was just relaxing at home, waiting for her adult son, Zoran, to come over for dinner. It was a beautiful, warm spring evening, so Zvonka had the kitchen windows open as she moved about, preparing a simple meal for herself. At some point, her phone rang. She picked it up and answered, hearing the voice of a friend on the other end. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained, panicked. The friend asked Zvanka if she was watching the news or listening to the radio. Zvanka said no and asked why. The friend then told her that there was a breaking news story all over the local channels. There had been a huge, terrible traffic accident right there in their town. And the friend said the reports were saying that Zvanka's son, Zoran, was involved. Zvanka let out a strangled cry. She dropped whatever she was holding, and without a second thought, she turned and ran out the front door of her apartment. As she burst outside, her next-door neighbor, who happened to be outside, saw her emerge looking frantic. The neighbor called out, "Hey, is everything okay?" Zvanka, who was already running towards the main road, just blurted out over her shoulder that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. The neighbor watched as Zvanka ran down the street, turned a corner, and disappeared from sight. Zvanka didn't own a car, so she was literally going to run all the way to the hospital to get to her son. A little while later, that same neighbor heard a knock on their door. The neighbor went and opened it and was completely shocked by who was standing on the doorstep. It was Zvanka's son, Zoran. He didn't have a scratch on him and didn't appear to be hurt in any way. Before the neighbor could even process what was happening, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, asked, "Hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet for dinner, and it's totally unlike her to just disappear without telling me where she was going." The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, trying to make sense of the situation. Then the neighbor asked, "Wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident?" Zoran just looked back at them, completely bewildered. "No," he said. "What are you talking about?" The neighbor then explained what had happened just a short while ago. They told him how his mother had run out of her house in a panic, saying he had been in an accident and that she was running to the hospital. Now it was Zoran's turn to be confused. He pulled out his phone and immediately called the local hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital staff answered, they told Zoran two things. First, his mother was not there. She hadn't been there at all that day. And second, while they had heard rumors about a car accident in town, no victims from any such accident had been brought to the hospital. By the end of the night, Zoran had no idea where his mother was, what had happened to her, or what this whole story about a car accident was about. He did the only thing he could think to do. He went to the police and reported his mother, Zvanka, missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, Zvanka was still missing. The police had no leads, no new information, nothing. On that day, a 5-6-year-old local reporter named Vlado Teneski, who happened to live not far from Zvanka, got a call from one of his confidential sources inside the police department. The source told him something that wasn't yet public information. Zvanka had just been found. And unfortunately, she was dead. Her body, which had been brutally beaten, strangled, and stabbed, had been found wrapped in plastic bags and dumped in an illegal garbage dump not far from the town's football stadium. The source also told Vlado that when her body was found, she still had her valuables on her, which seemed to rule out robbery as a motive. This was the part that puzzled the police. When they had started looking into Zvanka's life, they discovered she was just a poor, elderly cleaning lady. She had no known enemies. It made absolutely no sense that she would be the victim of such a brutal, personal, and violent murder that wasn't financially motivated. Vlado thanked his source for the information and hung up the phone. His source had sounded completely shocked by the murder, but Vlado wasn't so much shocked as he was suspicious. He felt like something about the official story was off. Maybe on the surface, Zvanka was just a poor cleaning lady with no enemies, but maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see. Vlado had no idea, but his reporter's intuition was telling him there was a much bigger story here and it needed to be investigated. Vlado had a reputation in Kisevo for being an aggressive, fearless journalist. He wasn't afraid to dive headfirst into murky stories involving corruption or abuse of power. He would regularly publish articles that were highly critical of the government, the police, or anyone in a position of authority, As a result, over his 30-year career, he had been threatened with violence many times for the things he had written. But even though Vlado knew this Zvonka murder case had the potential to put him in hot water again, he felt it was his duty to get to the truth. Feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, walked out of his house, and made the short walk over to Zvonka's apartment. When he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door. Soon, the two men were sitting in the kitchen, and Zoran was telling Vlado the whole strange story. He told him about the planned dinner, about finding his mom gone, and about the neighbor's bizarre story of her running to the hospital because of a non-existent car accident. As Zoran spoke, Vlado took meticulous notes, asking pointed follow-up questions. By the end of the interview, Vlado felt like he had a pretty good working theory about what had really happened to Zvonka. And the key to his theory was something Zoran had told him about his mother, that she was a cleaning lady. It took Vlado a couple of days to put his story together. He interviewed dozens more people in the neighborhood. Finally, on May 19th, just 3 days after Zvonka's body was found, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. The headline was "Explosive: A Serial Killer Stalks Kosovo." In the article, Vlado argued that Zvonka's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, he wrote, her murder was probably linked to the murders of 2 other women in their town. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zvonka. Not just in appearance, but in their lives. They were also poor older women who worked as cleaning ladies. This was the connection Vlado had made while interviewing Zoran. When Zoran described his mother, her age, and her profession, Vlado's mind had immediately gone to these other unsolved cases. The other 2 victims were 6-4-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and 5-6-year-old Lujubika Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Vlado's story was a bombshell. It was the first time anyone had publicly suggested that a serial killer was operating in their quiet little town. But the story was also explosive for another reason. Vlado was intensely critical of the police. He pointed out that the murders in 2005 and 2007 had been completely mishandled. An arrest had even been made in one of the cases, but clearly, Vlado argued, they had arrested the wrong person because the killer was still out there. When the police read Vlado's story, they were furious with him for his public criticism. However, they also had to admit that Vlado had uncovered a lot of details from his interviews that did seem to point towards the possibility of a serial killer. So, based almost entirely on Vlado's reporting, the police officially linked all 3 murders and began a new, high-priority investigation into a potential serial killer in their midst. But at the same time, Vlado began to notice something strange. He was being followed. Wherever he went in town to do his job, there would be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance, just watching him. Vlado figured this was their way of intimidating him, a form of blowback for his critical article. He just accepted it as part of the job and continued his work. By early June, about 2 weeks after Zvonka's body was found, the police's new serial killer investigation had narrowed its suspect pool from hundreds of people down to just 3. They felt they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, Vlado was still being tailed by police, and the police had not made any public statements about the case. That day, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer. The officer told the editor that they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. As soon as the call ended, the editor tried to phone Vlado to give him the scoop. But Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his phone. The editor also thought it was strange that the police source had called him, the editor, instead of Vlado, the reporter who had broken the story wide open. The editor tried calling Vlado several more times, but he never answered. The editor eventually just assumed that Vlado must have already heard about the imminent arrest from his own sources and was probably already on scene, ready to report on it. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, police had surrounded a modest 2-story home. It was overgrown with tall fir trees, and all the windows were covered with heavy drapes. Once the house was completely surrounded, a team of officers walked up to the front porch, knocked loudly on the door, and yelled for whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. For a moment, there was just tense silence. Then, the officers on the porch heard footsteps inside. They readied their weapons. The door slowly opened, and a man, who seemed unthreatening and confused, stepped out onto the porch. The police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper office, Vlado's editor got another phone call. It was the same police officer. This time, the officer was calling to say that the arrest had been made. They had caught their serial killer. Then, he told the editor the name of the person they had arrested. When the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado Tedeschi. It turned out that while Vlado appeared professional and calm on the outside, he was filled with an inner rage, specifically directed at his own mother, who had died in 2002 and who he viewed as a cruel and terrible person. After her death, he became obsessed with getting some kind of twisted revenge on her memory. His method was to find and kill random women who reminded him of his mother, poor, older, and working as cleaning ladies. All three of his victims, Mitra, Ljubica, and Zavanka, had actually known Vlado's mother personally. He had used that connection to gain each woman's trust before luring them to their deaths. Vlado had manipulated the entire narrative. In his explosive newspaper story, he had made things up to throw the police off his trail. For example, he invented a witness who claimed to have seen Zavanka get into a car with two men right before she vanished. That was a complete lie. He was also the one who had planted the fake story on the radio about Zoran's car accident. He had called his former colleagues at the radio station, and they had trusted him and broadcast the story without fact-checking. It was a deliberate, calculated trap to lure Zavanka out of her home. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was his own arrogance. In the very article that made him famous, he included specific details about the crime scenes that the police had never released to the public. For example, Vlado wrote that all three victims had been strangled with telephone cords that were left at the scene. This was a detail only the killer could have known. When the police read that, they immediately became suspicious of Vlado. The police officers who Vlado thought were tailing him to intimidate him were actually tailing him because he was their prime suspect. Eventually, they covertly obtained a DNA sample from him, and it was a match to evidence found at the crime scenes. He was the killer. After his arrest, Vlado was charged with 2 of the murders, and police were preparing to charge him with the 3rd, and were even looking into a possible 4th victim. But on June 23rd, just 3 days after his arrest, Vlado was found dead in his jail cell. The circumstances were bizarre. He had apparently drowned in a small bucket of water. There were 3 other inmates in the cell with him, all of whom claimed they didn't see or hear a thing. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide. And with his death, all of the murder investigations were closed forever. On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at his post, watching the line of cars waiting to cross from New York State into Ontario, Canada. As he looked out at the faces of the travelers, he felt a heavy sense of responsibility. His job wasn't just about checking passports and asking about declared goods. It was about being a gatekeeper, about making sure that dangerous criminals from the United States didn't use Canada as a hiding place. And on this particular day, there was one very specific, very dangerous criminal he was on high alert for. His name was Alex Mangal. He was 30 years old. Just a few days earlier, Alex Mangal had been pulled over for a routine traffic stop by a police officer near New York City. During that stop, things had gone horribly wrong. Alex had somehow managed to get the officer's gun, and he had shot the officer in the head, killing him instantly. Alex then fled the scene and had been on the run ever since. Law enforcement on both sides of the border was on high alert. New York was only a 6-hour drive from the Canadian border, and authorities were deeply concerned that Alex would try to slip into Canada to escape. So, an alert had been sent out to all border security personnel. They were to be on the lookout for a 30-year-old old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. All day long, that Canadian border guard scrutinized every person who drove up to his checkpoint. He looked closely at every driver, every passenger. He saw a family on their way to visit relatives. He saw a young couple who said they were on their honeymoon. He saw a man whose car was packed to the brim with camping supplies. He saw a middle-aged woman traveling by herself. He saw dozens of different people from all walks of life. But none of them matched the description of Alex Mangal. By the end of his long shift, after checking car after car, he felt confident that the cop killer had not passed through his checkpoint. He clocked out and went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was on patrol in a large shopping mall parking lot in Ontario, Canada, about an hour and a half's drive from the border. As he was making his rounds, he noticed a particular car, a white Toyota, that seemed to be just loitering in the area for a long time. His suspicion piqued. He decided to drive over and check it out. As he pulled up alongside the Toyota, he looked inside and saw someone sitting in the passenger seat. It was a white man who looked to be in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. The officer immediately recognized him from the wanted posters. It was Alex Mangal. The officer grabbed his radio and called for backup. Then he parked his cruiser, got out, and with his gun drawn, he cautiously approached the white Toyota. As he got closer to the passenger side door, the man inside turned and saw him. In a flash, the man jumped over into the driver's seat, fired up the engine, and the Toyota screeched out of the parking spot, speeding away. The officer sprinted back to his car and took off in pursuit. Within minutes, it seemed like the entire Toronto police force had joined the high-speed chase. They managed to funnel the fleeing car down a dead-end street. The white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and the man with the mustache and thinning brown hair jumped out. At that point, cornered and with nowhere to go, he gave up without a fight. He was taken into custody. Law enforcement was incredibly relieved to have the dangerous cop killer in custody. But they were also completely baffled. How did Alex Mangal get past border security? Every single guard was on high alert, looking for a man with his exact description. How did he slip through? The police had no answers until they searched the white Toyota that Alex had been driving. Here is what they figured out. On the night Alex shot and killed the police officer, he had fled into a nearby wooded area and hidden there overnight. The next day, he was walking around and happened to pass by a commercial building. He saw a middle-aged woman named Beverly Capone come out of the building and walk towards her car in the otherwise empty parking lot. Alex approached her, abducted her at gunpoint, and forced her to drive to an isolated cabin he knew of deep in the woods. Once they were there, he murdered her. And then, he did something truly monstrous. After she was dead, he stole her clothes and put them on. And then, he cut off her face and her scalp, and he wore them as a mask and a wig. He was literally wearing her skin and her hair. Dressed as a middle-aged woman, he got into her white Toyota and drove the 6 hours north to the Canadian border. He pulled up to the checkpoint, and he got through without anyone giving him a second look. It turned out that the Canadian border security guard, who had been so diligently looking for Alex Mangal all day, had in fact seen Alex Mangal. He just didn't recognize him. Because when Alex Mangal drove up to the checkpoint, he was wearing Beverly Capone's face, her hair, and her clothes. The guard saw what he believed was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he waved him through into Canada. The police pieced this all together when they searched the white Toyota after his arrest. Lying on the floorboard of the car, they found Beverly's dress, her scalp, and her face. Alex was deported back to the United States to stand trial for the murder of the police officer. However, before he could face justice, he attempted to escape from a prison transport vehicle. In the ensuing chaos, he was shot and killed by police. But that wasn't the end of Alex's story. Following his death, investigators continued to look into his past and search his property. During one of these searches, they made a disturbing discovery. They found a collection of photographs of unidentified women, along with several maps of New York and Pennsylvania. On these maps, various isolated remote locations were circled. No one knows what these maps or photos mean. Police have never been able to conclusively link Alex to any other murders, but he remains a person of interest in several unsolved disappearance cases. In fact, many investigators believe that Alex Mangol wasn't just a cop killer. They believe he was actually a serial killer. But because he took all of his secrets to the grave, we will probably never know for sure how many people he actually killed. On the morning of the 2nd of February 2012, a young man pulled his car off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, and into a large, snowy parking lot. He drove past dozens of parked cars until he reached a small, standalone shack that was painted a bright teal color. This was a popular drive-through coffee shop called Common Grounds, and the young man worked there as a barista. After he parked, he walked up to the white employee entrance door, pulled out his key, and went to unlock it. But as he turned the key, he realized the door was already unlocked. He knew the person who had worked the closing shift the previous night. It was an 18-year-old girl named Samantha Koenig. She had only been working at Common Grounds for about a month, but she always seemed very responsible. She had never forgotten to lock up before. The young man shrugged it off. People make mistakes. He pushed the door open and went inside. Right away, he noticed that things seemed out of place. The small kiosk was a mess. It looked like Samantha had just left in the middle of her shift without cleaning up at all. There were napkins scattered on the floor, used towels were left out on the counter, and dirty cups were still sitting by the espresso machine. As the young man walked over to the cash register to get it ready for the morning rush, he tried to run through scenarios in his head that could explain why Samantha had been so sloppy. He reached down with his key to unlock the cash register, and just like the front door, it was already unlocked. He pulled out the cash tray. All the money was gone. And that's when it hit him. They had been robbed. He immediately picked up the phone and called his boss. The night before, Samantha had arranged for her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift ended. Dwayne arrived at the Common Grounds kiosk at around 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift was supposed to be over. He had gotten held up at his own job, which was why he was late. When he pulled into the parking lot, he looked around for Samantha but didn't see her anywhere. The coffee shack itself was completely dark. It looked like it had been closed up for the night. Dwayne got out of his truck and walked through the freezing cold air up to the kiosk's service window. He pressed his face against the cold glass and peered inside, but he couldn't see anyone. His mind immediately went to the fight they'd had earlier that night over text message. She had accused him of cheating on her, and he had been dismissive about it, which had led to a really ugly argument. As Dwayne walked back to his truck, he thought to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight. Maybe she had called her dad or a friend to get a ride home at the end of her shift, and that's why she wasn't here waiting for him. He got back inside his truck and sent a text message to Samantha asking if she was okay and if she had gotten home. But after several minutes passed with no response, his worry started to grow. Even though they were fighting, he cared deeply about her. He decided he had to go by her house just to make sure she was there and that she was safe. A few minutes later, he pulled up to her house and knocked on the door. Her father, James, a single dad, answered. Dwayne explained that he couldn't find Samantha after her shift and was just checking to see if she was home. But James said, "She's not here. I haven't spoken to her. I have no idea where she is." The two men went into James's kitchen and sat down at the table. They both started calling and texting Samantha, trying to figure out where she was. After a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lit up. It was a text message from Samantha's number. The message made it clear that she was still very angry with him. It said that she needed some time to think and that she was going to stay with some friends for a couple of days. It also asked if he, Dwayne, would please let her father know where she was. Dwayne showed the text message to James. Samantha's father read it and immediately felt that something was wrong. This was very uncharacteristic of his daughter. He had raised Samantha on his own since she was 2 years old, and they were incredibly close. They told each other everything. It made no sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say she was going to be with friends. And it made even less sense that she would be ignoring all of his worried phone calls and text messages. The two men stayed up late into the night, calling and texting, hoping for another message from Samantha, but she never responded again. The following morning, with still no word from his daughter, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report. After receiving the report, an Anchorage police officer called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. The owner said that, coincidentally, she had just gotten a call from her morning barista informing her that the kiosk had been robbed overnight and that no one had been able to get in touch with Samantha. The owner told the officer that as soon as she could get the security footage from the previous night, she would send it over to the police. While they waited for the footage, some officers started calling Samantha's friends and family, but no one had seen or heard from her. Other officers went to the Common Grounds kiosk to investigate the scene. They found no signs of a struggle either inside or outside the small building. They also noted that there was a silent panic button located under the counter, which had not been pressed. So, even though Samantha's father felt that her final text message was strange, the police began to operate under the initial theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk herself and had run away. But this theory had problems. What confounded the police was how Samantha would have physically left the area. She didn't have a car that night, and the weather was brutally cold, far too cold to have just walked away. Anchorage isn't a very walkable city to begin with. And if she really was just taking a few days to be with friends, why did none of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop sent over the security footage. The footage, which had no audio, started around 8 p.m. on February 1st, the night Samantha went missing. It showed Samantha inside the kiosk, working alone. She seemed cheerful, busy, serving customers. Then, at some point, someone who is just out of the camera's view comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha turns to them, acknowledges the order, and then turns her back to make the drink. When she finishes, she turns back to the window to hand it to the person, and in that instant, her entire demeanor changes. She immediately steps back and puts her hands up in the air. A few seconds later, she reaches over and turns off all the lights inside the kiosk, plunging the interior into darkness. Then, she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, unmoving, for about a minute. Then, she slowly stands up and walks towards the cash register. She opens it, scoops out all the money, walks back to the window, and appears to hand the cash to a shadowy figure on the other side. Then, Samantha turns and kneels down again, with her back to the window. 2 more minutes pass. Then, the person outside the window leans their entire upper body through the small service window. They reach down and appear to be tying Samantha's hands behind her back. Because it was so dark inside the kiosk, the footage is extremely grainy, making it impossible to identify the person. But it's clearly a male, wearing a large hooded sweatshirt with the hood up and a hat pulled down low over his face. After he's finished tying Samantha's hands, the man leaps entirely through the window, landing inside the kiosk. He then shuts the window behind him. He pulls Samantha to her feet, puts what looks like a gun into her back, and marches her towards the employee door. He leads her out the door, across the snowy parking lot, to a white pickup truck. He puts her inside, and they drive off into the night. Over the next couple of days, the police and the FBI, who were now involved, hit one dead end after another. They had no physical evidence, no fingerprints, nothing. All they had was the grainy surveillance footage that didn't show the kidnapper's face. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, rallied the entire city of Anchorage to help search for his daughter. His passionate efforts attracted national news coverage, and soon Samantha's story was everywhere. Strangers donated thousands of dollars to a reward fund for information leading to her whereabouts. But despite the growing reward and the national media attention, no one came forward with any useful information. And there was still no word from Samantha or her captor. Then, on February 24th, 3 weeks after Samantha had been taken, Dwayne got another text message from her phone. It directed him to a specific sign in a nearby public park. Dwayne and James immediately shared the text with the police and then raced to the park, actually getting there about 15 minutes before the authorities. They walked through the gates, down a main trail, and stopped in front of the sign. It was a community bulletin board, and tacked to the board was a Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a typed ransom note, and Xeroxed onto the note was a black and white photo of Samantha. In the photo, Samantha looked dazed. She had a blank expression on her face, and she wasn't looking directly at the camera, but just off to the side. In the photo, a man's hand was visible, holding up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper, dated the 13th of February, 2012. It was a proof-of-life photo. Her captor was proving that she was still alive as of 11 days ago. For James and everyone involved, this was a small, agonizing bit of relief. At least, she had been alive last week. The ransom note demanded that James deposit $30,000 into his daughter's bank account. If he did, she would be released 6 months later. On the advice of the FBI, James deposited a small portion of the ransom money into Samantha's account. Then, the FBI just waited and watched. They knew that if anyone tried to use her debit card, they could track the location of the transaction. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made from ATMs within Anchorage. Each time, the FBI was notified and rushed to the location, but whoever was making the withdrawals was long gone by the time they arrived. Security footage from the ATMs showed a man wearing a ski mask and large sunglasses, making it impossible to identify him. After those 3 withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week. There was still no word from Samantha. Then, on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but this time they were in Arizona, then Mexico, and then Texas. Again, authorities would rush to the ATMs, but they were always just a few minutes too late. But this time, they got a break. In one of the surveillance videos from a Texas ATM, they spotted the car the masked man got into before he drove away. It was a small white sedan, a Ford Focus, and they saw him get on a highway heading east. An alert was put out to law enforcement in that part of Texas to be on the lookout for that car. On March 13th, a Texas state trooper spotted the white Ford Focus parked in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby. A short time later, a man in his 30S came out of a hotel room, walked to the car, and got in. The trooper followed him as he pulled out onto the road. He was looking for any reason to pull him over. He clocked the car with his radar gun and saw it was going 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. That was enough. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. The trooper walked up to the driver's side window. The man inside was calm. The trooper asked for his license. The man handed him an Alaska driver's license. His name was Israel Keys. He was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The trooper knew this was their guy. He called for backup, and soon, Keys was in custody. A search of his car turned up a ski mask, clothes that matched the description from the ATM videos, a gun, Samantha's cell phone, and her debit card. After his arrest, Keys initially denied any involvement in Samantha's disappearance. But when presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he caved. He said he would tell them the whole story of what happened to Samantha, but only if they met his demands: an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers bar, and a cigar. Once the investigators provided these items, he began to talk. And the story he told was so disturbing, so graphically violent, that the FBI has still not released the full transcript of his confession to the public. Here is what happened, based on the details that have been made public. On February 1st, Israel Keys had decided to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting to find a teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He ordered an Americano. But as she turned her back to make his drink, his plan suddenly changed. He wasn't just going to steal money. He was going to steal Samantha. When she turned back and handed him the drink, he pulled out his gun and told her it was a robbery. He forced her to turn off the lights, get on the ground, and hand over the money. Then he tied her hands, jumped inside the kiosk, stuffed napkins in her mouth to keep her quiet, and marched her out to his truck. Once they were in the vehicle, he told her that if she tried to escape or scream, he would kill her. He said she was very obedient and composed, despite being terrified. Keyes then took her phone and sent the text message to her boyfriend, Dwayne, creating the lie that she was with friends. He told Samantha he was holding her for ransom. She told him her family was poor and they wouldn't be able to pay much. Keyes replied, "Don't worry, they'll find a way." He drove around Anchorage for hours, then eventually went back to his own house. He made Samantha lie down in the back seat and covered her with tarps, telling her he would kill her if she moved. Then he went inside his house, where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. He was scheduled to leave with his daughter in just a few hours for a 2-week-long luxury cruise to New Orleans. Keyes went back out to his truck, put a blindfold on Samantha, and led her to a shed in his backyard. Inside, he sat her on a bucket and tied a rope around her neck, anchoring it to the wall behind her so she couldn't move. He cranked up a radio to mask any noise she might make, and told her again that he would kill her if she screamed. He gave her a couple of cigarettes and told her everything was going to be fine, that as soon as he got the ransom money, he would let her go. He turned on a couple of space heaters to keep her from freezing, then he left and locked the shed door. He went back inside, had some wine, and then a little while later went back out to the shed with a cup of water for her. He told investigators that Samantha asked him if he had spoken to her father about the ransom. Keyes lied and said yes, that everything was going according to plan. Then, in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, he untied her wrists and took the rope from around her neck. For a brief second, Samantha must have thought her nightmare was over. But then, Keyes grabbed her and tied her up again, much more tightly this time. He told investigators he just wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she was never going to be let go. He said that as he was tying her up the second time, she had a look of total resignation. She knew what was about to happen. After tying her up, he went back inside one last time to make sure his daughter and girlfriend were still asleep. They were. He went back to the shed. He assaulted Samantha. Afterwards, as he was getting dressed, she looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to kill me?" He said, "Yes, I am." Shortly before 4 a.m., he killed her. He told investigators she never made a sound. After she was dead, he left her body in the shed, went inside his house, and took a shower. Then he woke up his daughter and told her to get ready for their trip. While she was getting ready, he went back out to the shed, rolled Samantha's body in a tarp, and pushed it into a corner. He turned off the heaters and the music, locked the shed, and went back inside to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a taxi picked them up, and they left for the airport to begin their 2-week vacation. When he returned from the cruise, Keyes went back into the shed. He unrolled Samantha's body from the tarp. He then dressed her in new clothes, applied makeup to her face, braided her hair, and then used thread to stitch her eyelids open to make it look like she was alive and alert in a photograph. He held up the newspaper next to her and took the picture that would become the proof-of-life photo in the ransom note. After that, he dismembered her body and dumped the pieces in a frozen lake nearby. It turned out Samantha was not Israel Keyes' first victim. He was a prolific serial killer who preyed on completely random people for the thrill of it. For years, he had been burying kill kits all over the United States. These were caches filled with guns, zip ties, and tools for disposing of bodies. This way, no matter where he was in the country, if he got the urge to kill, he could just dig up his nearest kit and go hunting for a random stranger. He told investigators that the moment he saw Samantha in the coffee kiosk, he knew he was going to kill her. The robbery, the ransom, it was all just an elaborate lie to control her and give her false hope. Keyes admitted to killing Samantha and an older couple in Vermont, but in December of 2012, before he could name any of his other victims, he took his own life in his jail cell. To this day, no one knows for sure how many people Israel Keyes killed. The best guess, based on a drawing of 11 skulls that he made in his cell, is at least 11. But it's just a guess. The true number of his victims is a secret he took to the grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the freezing cold night of the 8th of February, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan was sitting around a roaring fire. He was with a big group of men deep inside a valley in western Colorado. The men gathered around that fire, Israel included, were all gold prospectors. That meant they spent their lives traveling the western United States, always looking for that next big score of gold. But for the past several weeks, this particular group of prospectors had been completely trapped in this valley. A series of terrible winter storms had moved in one after another, and each time a new storm hit, it would dump up to 6 feet of fresh snow, making any kind of travel impossible. They were stuck. On this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire just enjoying the warmth of the flames and listening to the other men tell stories, one of his friends stood up. This friend was another gold prospector, and his name was Alfred Packer. Alfred stood up and basically started to pitch an idea to the whole group. He wanted them to come with him and leave the valley right now. Alfred told everyone that the weather was starting to turn. He argued that it wasn't as bad as it had been, that the snow was even starting to melt a little, and then he made a big promise. Alfred said he knew a pathway out of there, a route that would take them out of the valley in just 2 weeks. Not only that, but this path would lead them directly to Breckenridge, Colorado. Breckenridge was a place that was well known by every prospector in the region. It was famous for having lots and lots of gold. So Alfred was essentially telling them, this is a win-win situation. We can finally get out of here, and we can get rich in the process. After Alfred finished his pitch, he sat back down. For a moment, everyone just stayed quiet. Israel kind of looked around the fire, watching the faces of the other men, trying to see if anyone was going to take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew that, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't really like Alfred. They often said he was lazy and difficult to be around. But Israel had a feeling that wasn't the real reason they didn't like his friend. He believed the real reason that other people didn't like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy. This meant that from time to time, he would have seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability on long, difficult journeys like this. On a trek through the mountains, the whole group really needs to be able to rely on every single person. Everyone needs to be able to pull their own weight. So, they were worried about a guy who at any given moment could just become kind of useless because he was in the middle of a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy didn't really matter all that much. He didn't see Alfred as some huge liability. In his eyes, Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. So, for him to stand up and make this pitch, it just felt like it was in keeping with who Alfred was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to blindly follow him and go along with this big plan. But he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing the pros and cons in his head, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire. He saw one of the other men, a really big guy, sitting there looking incredibly serious. And this big man was just shaking his head slowly back and forth as if to say, no, you guys can't seriously be considering leaving early. Then the big guy stood up. He held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically signaling for him to not say another word. Then this guy, while still looking directly at Alfred, spoke to the whole group. He said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And with that, the big guy just sat back down again. A tense silence fell over the entire group around the fire. Everyone just sat there, the only sound being the crackling of the flames. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different from everyone else sitting around that fire. His name was Ure, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabaguash band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Ore had, in fact, saved the lives of every single person sitting around that fire, Israel and Alfred included. Just a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up completely lost in this very valley, which was the valley where Chief Ore lived with his tribe. He had found them stumbling around in the snow on the absolute brink of death as the storms raged. So, Chief Ore and his people had brought the prospectors food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river. And then Chief Ore gave them some simple advice. He told them to stay put in this campsite and just ride out the winter. Then, in the springtime, when all the snow melts, it would be safe for all of them to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were nothing but thankful. They were just totally thrilled that Chief Ore had found them and given them this campsite. It was a lifeline. And so they had no problem at all agreeing to wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being more or less trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried that if they didn't leave soon, all the good spots would be taken and there would be no more gold left for them to mine. For Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold. He had told his family back home that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. This was his final shot. So, he really couldn't afford to go home empty-handed. He literally needed to find gold in order to continue to survive and to take care of his family. So, when Alfred stood up again and broke that tense silence, he spoke directly to Chief Ore. He said, "Thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early, and I just hope others will come with me." At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred's eyes. And Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. So, Israel spoke up. He said, "You know what? I'll go with you as well." And then, after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Ore could tell that he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. So, even though he felt like this was a truly terrible idea, he shifted his focus. He went from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were about to go into. So he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him. Then Chief Ore knelt down and drew a map in the dirt on the ground. He told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that they had to follow the river out of the valley. He explained that it would bring them to a mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range. And he was very clear. He told them, "You cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You have to follow that river and go around the mountain range." He said that once they did that on the other side, there would be an outpost where they could stop, get supplies, rest up, and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then, after Chief Ore had explained all of this, he made sure to mark a big X on his dirt map, showing them exactly where that outpost would be. And with that, Chief Ore just turned around, walked over to his horse, and rode away. Shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for the night, their minds made up. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they all got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors, a man who had not volunteered to go with them and who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward. He said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go using his horse. But at some point, he would have to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. The men were very thankful for this offer. And so, shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go. They said their goodbyes, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out of the valley, they started to see it off in the distance. The huge, jagged peaks of the San Juan mountain range. But they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path that Chief Ore had told them about, because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. As Israel trudged through the deep snow in a single file line of men, he held on tightly to a metal coffee pot. Inside this pot, he kept hot coals from the fire. This was a little trick he had learned over the years. Not only did it keep his hands warm in the brutal cold, but also, if he ever ran out of matches, he could easily start a new fire using the coals. It was a simple but effective tool for survival. And so, as he's clutching this wonderfully warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him. He turned around and saw it was Alfred. And Alfred looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel felt. And so, without even thinking about it, Israel just handed his warm coffee pot off to Alfred. Alfred took it and clutched it to his chest, and his face showed obvious relief and thankfulness. Now, none of these gold prospectors had ever struck it rich. They were all basically poor men chasing a dream. But of all of them, Alfred really had the least. He had almost nothing to his name. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. There was also the age difference. Alfred was 30 years old, which was half the age of Israel. So Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid who was just trying to find his way in the world. Alfred had also confided in Israel about his past. He told him that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions. He wanted to fight against the slave-holding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they had kicked Alfred out because of his epilepsy. But that hadn't stopped Alfred from getting a tattoo on his arm with his battalion information and his name. Unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he had misspelled his own name when he gave it to the tattoo artist. And so, when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D, and from that point on, that was what people called him. Nobody called him Alfred, they called him Alfred. And this was kind of a source of embarrassment for him. And then, after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of just bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down anywhere and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help, a little bit of kindness. So, after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flask with some alcohol in it. He handed it to Israel almost as a silent thank you for giving him the warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing the flask and the coffee pot back and forth between them. By late afternoon that day, the snow was really starting to come down hard again. The prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he finally reached a point where he had to stop. He said his horse just couldn't go any farther, the weather was getting too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies in the snow, wished them luck, and then he turned his horse around and headed back down the trail toward the valley. And it's very likely that as these 6 men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the exact same thought. I just have to suck it up for 2 weeks, get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge, and I will become rich. 2 weeks passed by. And Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Array had pointed out. The one that was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was supposed to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by. And still, they did not show up at the outpost. And they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas either. They had simply vanished. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving slightly. It was snowing less. But within just a couple of days of this group setting off on their trip, those brutal winter storms came back with a vengeance. They just dumped incredible amounts of snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey were the men themselves, and also Chief Ouray and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay behind in the valley until spring. But even if Chief R.A. and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in serious trouble, there was nothing they could do. They would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley themselves and basically couldn't do anything. And so, in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 men were totally lost somewhere out in the wilderness, but nobody even knew they were missing. But that would all change on the 16th of April, 1874. This was roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost, the same one that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast inside one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating and talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open. These officials, they all turn around and they see a man standing in the doorway. He was a totally disheveled-looking guy with long, matted hair that was sticking up in the air and a huge, bushy beard. In one hand, he was holding a rifle, and in the other hand, he was clutching a metal coffee pot. His eyes were darting like crazy from side to side, and he was clearly in a state of shock. He was trying to speak, but he just couldn't get any words out. This man was Alfred Packer. And it was obvious to the officials that this man was in dire need of help. And so, without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door against the cold, got him some food, and got him some water. Immediately, Alfred started wolfing down the food as fast as he could until he began vomiting. At which point, he apologized profusely to the men. He said, "I've been starving out in the wild for weeks. It must have done something to my intestinal tract. It's probably damaged." But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over their floor. They were just worried that this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put him in some warm, dry clothes. Then Alfred asked them if they had any whiskey. He said he wanted to kind of warm his body up from the inside. They said no problem, and they handed him some whiskey. Alfred threw a couple of shots back, and after that, it was pretty obvious that he had kind of relaxed a little bit. And at that point, one of the officials finally asked Alfred the question that was on all of their minds. "What happened to you?" As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials his story. He said that he had been with 5 other men, and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, a huge storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the path they were on. And so, the group made a fateful decision. They decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range, the one thing Chief O'Ray had specifically told them not to do. He had said, "Do not go over the mountains." They decided to do that anyway. But as they were trying to traverse these treacherous mountains, it became clear that Alfred just was not keeping up with the rest of the group. And so, he said, they made the decision to leave him behind. To leave him behind to die. He knew he was being abandoned, and he had to watch as his 5 friends disappeared into the blowing snow. But amazingly, Alfred told them he did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months just stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going. He survived by eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the one thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was that when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. The one Israel had given him, and so at night he was able to start fires to stay warm. He also told them that at one point he was so hungry that he had cooked his own leather shoes in the fire and ate them. Because again, this guy was starving. And so really he was on the brink of death when he just randomly stumbled into this outpost and found their cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent. And Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, "Have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive?" And they would have to tell him, "No, it's only you. We have not seen anybody else." Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away. Mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It had been 2 months since they had started that journey. The chances were just not good that they had survived the harsh winter in the mountains. But even if these other men were somehow not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to even begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search party because he's the only one who knows where they could possibly be. But Alfred was in no condition to go back out into the wild and lead a search. He was not healthy enough. And so, for several weeks, Alfred just stayed at the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so, it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men. On the 20th of August, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado. He was roughly in the same area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible, horrible smell. And so, John followed the smell until it brought him to a clearing. And in the clearing was what looked like an old, beat-up campsite. And so, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who might be in this campsite. But when he turned a corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze. Because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men, all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in complete shock from what he was seeing, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether. And the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically just skeletons, but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lifelike that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away, but he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies. And when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chests, looked surgical. Like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not the result of random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away were the remains of a burned-out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods. And he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there. But it had all the signs of someone living there for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together in his mind, and John realized what he had just stumbled upon. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered. And the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or maybe even months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This was a cannibal's camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy going to come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so, kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook he carried with him, he quickly sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out that John, the illustrator, was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was supposedly left behind to die, those 5 other men didn't carry on into the night. Somebody attacked them, began killing them, and then eating them. And that person was Alfred Packer. That was why Alfred had survived for so long out in the wilderness. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night. It was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even exactly when he killed them. All we know is that based on the investigation of the scene, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered. But the 5th victim, who was actually Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was in self-defense, and that somebody else killed the other 4. His story was kind of confusing despite those claims. There was one thing Alfred never denied, and that was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat. When they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But, despite it being right there, a fresh source of food, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that instead. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 59 years old, he was granted parole. And right away, Alfred became a vegetarian. He died a few years later, taking the full story of what truly happened in those mountains to his grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Have you ever stopped to think about how a single, seemingly minor decision can completely change the course of your life, or even end it in an instant? We like to think we are in control of our own destinies, that the choices we make every day are safe and calculated. But today, we are going to look at 5 incredibly tragic stories about people who made just one wrong turn, took one unnecessary risk, or stepped into a place they never should have been. These are stories of beautiful days that turned into nightmares, exciting nights out that ended in unimaginable horror, and ordinary workdays that became scenes from a disaster movie. Each of these people had dreams, families, and bright futures ahead of them. But in a split second, a single choice sealed their fate, showing just how fragile our lives really are when we cross the line into the unknown. Our first story takes us to Europe, to a gorgeous, picturesque town called Sevnica. It is located right in the heart of Slovenia, and it is situated right along the Sava River, which is one of the longest and most beautiful rivers in all of Europe. For many generations, the section of the Sava River that flowed right past the town of Sevnica was a popular destination for kayakers and canoeists. People would travel from all over the region just to spend a peaceful afternoon paddling down this scenic stretch of water. But all of that changed in the year 2008. At that time, a massive new hydroelectric dam was being built across the river. This dam was designed to provide clean, reliable electricity for the town and the surrounding area, which was a great thing for the local economy. But for the people who loved the river, it was a bit of a tragedy. The construction of this dam created a total dead end for anyone trying to navigate through this section of the Sava River. Once the dam was completed, boaters would no longer be able to just float down the river uninterrupted. Instead, they would have to paddle up to the dam, pull their boats out of the water, carry them all the way around the massive concrete structure on foot, and then put them back in on the other side. For many locals, this marked the end of an era. The mayor of Sepnica, who had been a major supporter of the dam's construction, understood that this project was a bit of a disappointment for the local community. He wanted to do something to acknowledge the history of the river and to give the townspeople one last chance to experience the waterway as it used to be. And so, he decided to organize a special event. He called it the Final Descent. The plan was simple. The mayor would lead a group of local citizens and officials on one final canoe trip down the Sava River, passing right through the area where the dam was being built while the river was still open. He went all around the town talking to business owners, council members, and friends, and he managed to recruit 27 other people to join him on this historic journey. A few weeks later, on the 3rd of July 2008, after all the preparations had been made, the mayor and his crew gathered upstream at a local loading area. The weather that day was absolutely perfect. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the water was incredibly calm, looking almost like a sheet of glass. At the loading area, a local company had set out 4 large canoes for the group. Each canoe was designed to hold up to 7 people. Before they pushed off, the staff members who had provided the canoes offered everyone in the group life jackets. But, surprising as it might seem, almost everyone in the group turned them down. It is not entirely clear why they made this choice, but many believe it was because the river looked so calm and peaceful that afternoon. They were not planning on being on the water for very long, and they probably thought that wearing bulky life jackets on such a warm, beautiful day was just unnecessary and uncomfortable. And so, without any life jackets on board, all 28 people climbed into the 4 canoes, 7 people per boat. They pushed off from the shore and began their slow, relaxing journey down the Sava River. The mayor wanted to make sure this historic trip was well documented, so he had hired a professional photographer to come along with them. As the canoes drifted down the river, the photographer, who was riding in the 4th canoe, was busy taking pictures and filming videos of the group. Everyone was laughing, chatting, and enjoying the beautiful scenery. It felt like a perfect summer afternoon. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their trip, the canoes rounded a bend in the river, and the massive concrete structure of the new hydroelectric dam came into view about 1,000 feet ahead of them. Even though the dam was still under construction, the main physical structure was largely finished. From their position on the water, they could easily see the massive concrete archways where the river would eventually be blocked off. Almost immediately, the group realized they had a problem. The mayor's original plan had been based on information he received from the construction crew. They had told him that the left side of the dam would have a temporary open waterway that had not been blocked off yet. Because the dam was not fully completed, the crew said there would be a safe, calm channel where the canoes could easily float right past the construction site without any danger. But as the canoes got closer, it became very obvious that this open channel did not exist. The construction schedule must have changed, or there was a misunderstanding because the entire width of the river was now blocked by the concrete barriers. There was no simple way to float around it. To keep going, they would have to pull the canoes over to the bank, get out, and carry them around the dam. Because the current was extremely weak and the water was moving very slowly, there was no immediate danger. The group had plenty of time to make a decision, and they easily could have paddled to the shore. Most of the people in the canoes intuitively knew that the safest and smartest choice was to pull over to the riverbank, get out of the water, and either walk around the structure or just end the trip right there. But as they sat there discussing their options, the mayor and a few other people in the leading canoes came up with a different idea. They looked at the dam and thought, why don't we just go over it? Now, the construction crew had explicitly warned the mayor beforehand that they should absolutely not try to go over the dam under any circumstances because it was extremely dangerous. But from where the canoes were floating, the drop did not look bad at all. This was not a massive towering dam with a sheer vertical drop. It was a relatively low structure where the water slid down a concrete embankment that was only about 10 or 15 feet long. At the bottom of this slide, the water was a bit rough and frothy, but it did not look like anything a large canoe couldn't handle. To the mayor, it looked like it would be a fun, exciting adventure, almost like going down a slide at a water park. He began encouraging the others, making it sound like a great way to top off their historic trip. Before long, the occupants of 3 of the 4 canoes agreed to go along with the plan. They decided they were going to ride their canoes right over the edge of the dam. The people in the 4th canoe, which included the photographer, were not comfortable with this idea. They told the others that they were not going to risk going over the dam, but they agreed to pull up next to the concrete structure on the left bank and film the other 3 canoes as they made their descent. It would make for some incredible footage. With the plan set, the 4 canoes continued their approach. When they were about 100 or 200 feet away from the dam, the 4th canoe pulled off to the left. The passengers got out onto the solid ground, and the photographer lifted his camera, pointing it toward the river to record his friends. The video footage captured by the photographer, which was later released to the public, shows the first of the 3 canoes heading directly toward one of the open concrete gates of the dam. In the video, you can see the 7 people in the canoe. They are smiling, laughing, and waving at the camera. They look like they are filled with that nervous excitement you get right before a roller coaster drops. They guide their canoe into the darker section inside the concrete archway, preparing to slide down the embankment. As they enter the shadows and begin to disappear from view, the camera captures the back end of their canoe, suddenly popping up into the air as the front of the boat tilts downward, sliding down the concrete slope. But then, a second later, the happy atmosphere vanishes. You hear a sudden, sharp scream from one of the passengers inside the tunnel, and then the audio goes completely silent, and the video cuts out. As soon as that first canoe hit the churning water at the bottom of the slide, it did not ride smoothly over the waves. Instead, the force of the water instantly flipped the heavy canoe, throwing all 7 passengers directly into the roaring river. Because they were not wearing life jackets, they had absolutely nothing to keep them afloat. They did not even have a second to catch their breath or try to swim to safety before they were violently sucked deep underwater. The danger at the bottom of the dam was not just the rough, churning water. Because this was a hydroelectric dam, there were massive underwater tunnels built into the base of the structure. These tunnels functioned like incredibly powerful vacuums. They were designed to pull massive amounts of water down inside them, channeling the river past giant turbines. The force of the rushing water would spin these turbines, which is what actually generated the electricity for the town. Once the water passed through the turbines, it was shot back out into the river further downstream. Even though the dam itself was not fully finished and was not yet generating power for the grid, these underwater tunnels and turbines were already fully operational and running. As those first 7 people were thrown into the water, they were immediately caught in the powerful suction of these intake tunnels. They had absolutely no way to fight against the current. Meanwhile, the people in the 2nd and 3rd canoes had no idea what had just happened to their friends. Because of the concrete walls and the noise of the rushing water, they couldn't see or hear the first canoe capsize. And so, they kept paddling forward. The 2nd canoe went right over the slide, and just like the first one, it flipped instantly at the bottom. All 7 of its passengers were thrown into the churning white water and were immediately sucked down into the dark underwater tunnels. A moment later, the 3rd canoe made its descent. By some incredible stroke of luck, this 3rd canoe did not capsize. It managed to hit the water at the bottom, ride out the rough waves, and float safely out into the calmer water downstream. Once they cleared the rough area, the passengers in the 3rd canoe turned around, expecting to see their friends in the other 2 boats paddling right behind them. But the river was completely empty. There was nobody out in front of them, and there was nobody behind them. Confused and starting to panic, they looked back toward the base of the dam. They didn't see any people, but they saw one of the canoes floating completely upside down, and the other canoe was being violently ripped apart, its wooden planks spinning around in the churning white water. Realizing that something terrible had happened, the survivors in the third canoe desperately turned their boat around and tried to paddle back toward the base of the dam to search for survivors. They wanted to pull their friends out of the water, but as they got closer, they realized there was nobody to save. The water was empty. The 14 people who had been in those two canoes had completely vanished beneath the surface. Out of the 14 people who fell into the river that afternoon, 13 would lose their lives. The mayor was among the dead. The only person to survive the plunge was the mayor's wife. By some absolute miracle, when she was thrown into the water, she managed to fight against the powerful suction of the underwater tunnels and swim out of their grasp, eventually clawing her way to the safety of the riverbank. Over the next several days and weeks, a massive recovery operation was launched. Police divers and search teams combed the river, eventually recovering all 13 bodies. The power of the river's current and the underwater tunnels was so immense that one of the bodies was found 25 miles downstream, having crossed the border into the neighboring country of Croatia. The local authorities never released any specific details about the condition of the bodies when they were found, so it remains unclear if the victims died from drowning or if the massive underwater turbines played a direct role in their deaths. All the public knows is that a beautiful summer afternoon and a simple decision to seek a little bit of adventure ended in one of the worst tragedies in the history of the region. And now we are going to look at our second story, which takes us back to the United States in the early 1980s. In a small town called Delaware, Ohio, which is located just outside the state's capital of Columbus, there was a 17-year-old high school senior named John Harder. John was the definition of a popular kid. He was athletic, handsome, and incredibly well-liked by his peers. But unlike the classic stereotype of the popular high school jock who is a mean bully, John was known for being incredibly warm-hearted, kind, and friendly to absolutely everyone he met. He had a great sense of humor and loved to play harmless pranks just to make people smile. During one memorable high school pep rally, John, who was not a cheerleader, enthusiastically joined the cheerleading squad on the gym floor, jumping and chanting along with them, which had the entire school laughing and cheering. John was set to graduate from high school on the 5th of June 1983, and he had a very bright future ahead of him. He had already been accepted to Kent State University, where he planned to study accounting in the fall. A few weeks before graduation, John's high school began selling tickets for a special event called Grad Night. This event was held at a massive amusement park called Kings Island, which was located about 2 hours west of Delaware, Ohio. Kings Island was famous for its incredible roller coasters, water rides, and games. During these grad nights, the amusement park would close its doors to the general public, allowing only high school seniors who had purchased these special student tickets to enter. It was a safe, fun way for graduating seniors from all over the state to celebrate their achievements together. John was incredibly excited about the trip, and he bought tickets along with about 20 of his classmates. At around 3:30 p.m. on Friday, the 13th of May, 1983, John and his friends met up outside of their high school. Even though this was a school-sponsored event, the school did not provide buses. The students were responsible for driving themselves to the amusement park. After making sure everyone was there, they piled into several cars and began the 2-hour drive to Kings Island. During the trip, John, who was a passenger in one of the cars, began drinking heavily. By the time they arrived at the park, he had consumed half a bottle of rum and between 3 and 6 beers. When he finally got out of the car in the Kings Island parking lot at around 7 p.m., he was visibly heavily intoxicated. He could barely stand up straight and was slurring his words. Despite his condition, John and his friends made their way to the front gate, showed their special tickets to the attendants, and were allowed inside the park. Even though it was a private event, the park was incredibly crowded, packed with thousands of excited teenagers from high schools all over Ohio. Once inside, the students from Delaware High School did not stay together as one giant group. They naturally split up into smaller groups of close friends to explore the rides. John was in a small group that included his girlfriend, Pam. But instead of having a fun, exciting night, John and Pam spent their first hour in the park bickering and fighting. Other students who saw them that night would later report that John looked extremely upset, highly emotional, and obviously very drunk. By 8:30 p.m., as John's group was waiting in line for one of the park's popular roller coasters, John was openly complaining, telling his friends that he didn't even want to be there anymore and just wanted to go home. It was clear to everyone that he was just trying to make Pam feel bad because he was angry at her. His friends tried to calm him down, telling him that he was overreacting and that once they got on the ride and got some food, he would feel much better. But John was in a terrible mood and seemed completely incapable of enjoying himself. At around 9 p.m., John and his group finally boarded the roller coaster and went on the ride. When the ride ended and the passengers disembarked, the group walked over to a nearby open area to regroup and figure out which ride they wanted to go to next. But when they looked around, they realized John was gone. He had completely vanished. At first, his friends weren't too worried. They knew how upset and angry John had been before they got on the ride. They figured he had probably just walked off to clear his head and be by himself for a little while, and they assumed they would run into him later in the night. So, the group continued exploring the park, going on rides and playing games, and they eventually lost track of time. It wasn't until the end of the night, when the park's loudspeakers announced that Kings Island was closing and everyone needed to head toward the exits, that John's friends began to worry. They walked out to the parking lot, fully expecting to find John leaning against one of their cars, waiting for them because he wanted to go home. But when they reached the cars, John was nowhere to be found. They met up with the other groups of students from their high school, but nobody had seen John since 9 p.m. They stood in the parking lot, staring at the main entrance, waiting for him to walk out. But as the minutes ticked by, the park's lights began to shut down one by one, and a security guard came out and locked the front gates. That was when they knew they had a serious problem. Following a detailed investigation by the police, detectives were eventually able to piece together a reconstruction of what they believe happened to John after he walked away from his friends at 9 p.m. After getting off the roller coaster, John had slipped away from his group before anyone could see him. In his highly intoxicated and emotional state, he stumbled his way through the crowded park toward one of Kings Island's most famous attractions, a massive 300-foot-tall replica of the Eiffel Tower. This structure was built to be an exact one-third scale replica of the real Eiffel Tower in Paris, France. It featured 3 large elevators that ran up the center of the tower's metal structure. These elevators would take guests up to 2 different viewing platforms, one located 50 feet off the ground and a much higher one located at 275 feet. Today, the only way for visitors to access these platforms is by riding the elevators. But back in 1983, there was also a large flight of stairs that ran up the very center of the tower, from the ground all the way to the top. At the time, the public was allowed to walk up these stairs, but only as far as the first platform at 50 feet. The stairs did continue past the 50-foot mark all the way to the top of the tower, but this upper section was strictly off-limits to guests. To prevent people from climbing any higher, the park had installed a heavy 6-foot-tall metal gate directly across the staircase at the 50-foot platform, complete with signs warning that the area beyond was for authorized personnel only. When John arrived at the base of the tower, he didn't line up for the elevators. Instead, he began climbing the stairs. He made his way up to the 50-foot platform, and when he reached the locked metal gate, he didn't turn back. Instead, he climbed over the gate and continued walking up the dark, empty stairs, completely unnoticed by park staff or other guests. John climbed higher and higher into the metal framework of the tower until he came to a stop just below the 275-foot platform. At this point, he was standing on the narrow staircase, surrounded by a maze of steel beams. He decided to climb over the safety railing of the stairs and step out onto a narrow metal beam that was part of the tower's structural support system. He grabbed onto another beam above his head for balance and began to slowly shimmy his way along the narrow steel beam, moving toward the very center of the tower, right where the 3 active elevator shafts were located. There were no safety nets or barriers of any kind. If John lost his grip or slipped, he would fall hundreds of feet to his death. If he kept walking, he would step directly into the path of the massive elevator cars that were constantly moving up and down the shafts. The designers of the tower had never anticipated that a guest would climb past the security gates and walk out onto the exposed structural beams, so there were no safety features in place to protect someone in this area. But John, driven by alcohol and emotion, kept moving until he was standing right on the edge of one of the active elevator shafts, looking down into the darkness. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how the elevators at Kings Island operated. Each elevator car was suspended by a thick metal cable that ran from the top of the car up to the very top of the tower, where it looped through a massive pulley system anchored to the ceiling. From there, the cable ran back down the shaft, where it was attached to a massive, incredibly heavy counterweight. The counterweight was designed to balance the weight of the elevator car. Whenever the elevator car moved up the shaft, the counterweight would move down, and when the elevator car moved down, the counterweight would move up. As John was standing on the edge of the shaft, looking around at the view, one of the elevator cars down below him began to descend. As the car went down, its massive metal counterweight began to rise rapidly up the shaft, heading directly toward the spot where John was standing. John was leaning out over the open shaft, likely looking down at the moving car, completely unaware of the massive counterweight coming up behind him. A second later, the heavy counterweight slammed into John, striking him with incredible force and knocking him off the beam. The impact was so violent that John was actually impaled on some of the exposed metal wiring and cables on top of the counterweight, getting his body completely tangled in the machinery. Inside the descending elevator car, the operator, a young park employee, felt a sudden, violent jolt, as if the car had struck something or jumped on its tracks. Fearing that there was a mechanical malfunction with the elevator, the operator rode the car all the way down to the ground level, let all the passengers out, and decided to run a test. He closed the doors of the empty car and began to ride it back up the tower to make sure everything was working properly. As the empty elevator car went up, the counterweight on the other side of the shaft began to go down. This reversed the motion of the machinery that John's body was tangled in. As the counterweight descended, John's dangling body struck one of the tower's horizontal steel beams. The force of the impact pried his body off the counterweight and threw him over the edge, sending him plunging 200 feet down the center of the elevator shaft. John landed directly on the roof of the rising elevator car, dying instantly from the impact. Inside the car, the operator was just passing the 50-foot platform when he heard an unbelievably loud, violent thud on the metal roof above his head, causing the elevator to instantly grind to a halt. A second later, blood began pouring down the outside of the elevator's glass windows. The park administration acted incredibly fast. They immediately shut down the tower, blocked off the area, and called the police, managing to keep the horrific accident a secret from the thousands of other guests still in the park. But when the police arrived, they found that John was not carrying any form of identification. They had no idea who he was or how to contact his family. It wasn't until late that night, when John's worried friends in the parking lot approached a security guard to report him missing, that the pieces began to come together. The guard told them that there had been a fatal accident inside the park and that the police were currently trying to identify a young man's body. He suggested they go to the local hospital to see if they could identify him. John's devastated friends went to the hospital and confirmed that the victim was indeed John Harder. To this day, nobody knows for sure why John did what he did. Some believe it was just a terrible, alcohol-fueled mistake. Others speculated that he might have been suicidal, though his family and close friends vehemently denied this, saying he had everything to look forward to. Many believe John, who loved attention and pranks, was simply trying to pull off a daring, dangerous stunt to show off, and it cost him his life. This brings us to our third story, which takes us to the hot, humid summer of 2017 inches, a quiet, rural suburb called Wama, Florida, located just south of Tampa. There was a 21-year-old man named Antonio Navarrete who felt like he was on top of the world. A year earlier, Antonio had met the absolute love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez, and the two had fallen deeply in love. Now, Daisy was pregnant with their first child. Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents to save money, but they were incredibly excited about starting their own family. Antonio was a young man with a bright future. Ever since he was a little kid, he had been completely obsessed with cars. He would take his toy cars apart just to see how they worked and then put them back together. As he got older, he became incredibly skilled at drawing highly detailed, intricate designs for custom cars. By the time he was a teenager, he was spending all his free time working on real vehicles. Eventually, Antonio saved up enough money to buy his own car, a white Chevrolet lowrider pickup truck that he lovingly nicknamed Casper. Antonio was a very shy, quiet guy, and he was definitely not a ladies' man. But it was actually thanks to Casper that he met Daisy in the first place. One weekend, Antonio drove his custom truck to a local car meetup where car enthusiasts gathered to show off their customized vehicles. While walking around the parking lot, Antonio spotted Daisy standing on the far side of the crowd. He was so struck by her beauty that he just stood there, staring at her. Eventually, Daisy looked up, caught him looking, and gave him a warm smile. The two started talking, and from that moment on, they were inseparable. Shortly after Daisy moved in with Antonio and they shared the happy news of the pregnancy with their families, Antonio got more great news. He had landed a high-paying job with a company that did contract maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant located in Apollo, Florida, about 10 miles away. It wasn't his dream job of being an auto mechanic, but it paid $12 an hour, which was double what he had been making before. With this new income, he and Daisy would finally be able to save up enough money to get their own apartment before the baby was born in the fall. Some of his friends who worked at the plant told him the job was incredibly easy and that he would basically just be driving a golf cart around the massive facility, picking up trash. On the 24th of June, 2017, Antonio drove Casper to the Big Bend power plant for his very first day of work. As he drove, he looked at a photo of Daisy that he had taped to his dashboard. She and his mother were the most important people in his life, and he was determined to work hard to provide for them. When Antonio arrived at the plant, he was absolutely awestruck by its sheer size. The Big Bend power plant was a massive industrial complex sitting right on the water, with 4 enormous smokestacks rising high into the sky, constantly releasing thick plumes of white smoke. The plant generated electricity by burning coal on a massive scale. The burning process took place inside 4 large independent units. Each unit featured a humongous boiler, which was essentially a 12-story tall industrial oven. Coal was fed into the bottom of these boilers, where it was burned at extremely high temperatures, creating steam. This steam would rise up the boiler, spinning massive turbines to generate electricity before traveling up the smokestacks and out into the air. A natural byproduct of burning coal is ash. In newer modern power plants, this airborne ash is captured inside the boiler. But 3 of the 4 units at the Big Bend plant had been built in the 1970s and used older technology. In these older units, the ash would get so hot that it would melt, turning into a thick, red-hot liquid called slag. Slag is essentially the industrial equivalent of molten volcanic lava. As this molten slag accumulated inside the massive boiler, it would drain through a man-sized opening at the very bottom of the unit. Directly beneath this opening was a 30-foot-tall, water-filled cooling tank. When the red-hot liquid slag fell into the cold water, it would instantly cool and harden into solid glassy rocks. These rocks would settle at the bottom of the cooling tank, where a large grinding mechanism would crush them into tiny chips. These cooled slag chips would then be collected and sold to companies to make everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. For his first few days on the job, Antonio's routine was very quiet. He spent most of his time sitting in a break room, watching safety training videos, or trying to navigate the confusing, maze-like corridors of the massive plant. It was a loud, chaotic, and dangerous environment, with massive trucks driving through the building and heavy machinery constantly running all around him. But by his 4th day, Antonio felt like he was finally starting to get the hang of things. On Thursday, the 29th of June 2017, Antonio woke up in a fantastic mood. The very next day, Daisy had an appointment for an ultrasound, and they were finally going to find out if their baby was a boy or a girl. Antonio kissed Daisy goodbye, walked out to his truck, and drove to work, excited for the future. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was walking through the aisles of a local grocery store when she felt her phone vibrate in her purse. She pulled it out and saw that she had a missed call from Antonio, and he had left a voicemail. She pressed play and held the phone to her ear, expecting to hear her son's cheerful voice. Instead, she heard the most terrifying, traumatic thing a mother could ever hear. Earlier that afternoon, a serious double malfunction had occurred simultaneously inside Unit 2 at the power plant. First, inside the 12-story tall boiler, the molten slag had cooled slightly and formed a massive solid plug directly over the man-sized drainage hole. Because the hole was blocked, the liquid slag could not drain into the cooling water tank. Instead, it was rapidly piling up inside the active boiler, getting heavier and heavier by the minute. At the exact same time, completely independent of the blockage in the boiler, a large buildup of hardened slag rocks had jammed the grinding mechanism at the bottom of the cooling tank, preventing any of the crushed slag from being emptied out. Unit 2 was completely crippled. The proper, safe way to fix these blockages was to shut down Unit 2's boiler, let the entire system cool down, and then send in specialized teams. They would drop dynamite into the boiler to blast away the slag plug, and then workers could safely enter the drained cooling tank to chip away the blockage around the grinder. But turning off a massive industrial boiler at a power plant is an incredibly expensive process that cost the company a fortune in lost electricity production. Rather than shutting down the unit, the management at Tampa Electric Company decided to have the workers clear the blockages while the 12-story boiler was still active and burning coal at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At around 4 p.m., a senior plant manager gathered a team of 5 other workers, including Antonio, and led them to the base of Unit 2 to perform the repairs. The plan was to completely drain the water from the 30-foot-tall cooling tank. Once empty, they would open a heavy metal access door near the bottom of the tank, known as the doghouse door. This door would give them a direct line of sight into the bottom of the empty tank, right where the grinding mechanism was jammed. The workers would then stand in front of the open door and fire high-pressure water cannons through the opening to blast the hardened slag rocks loose from the grinder. Once the grinder was cleared, they would close the door and figure out how to handle the slag plug inside the boiler. The company had asked workers to perform this exact type of hot repair in the past, and because nothing bad had ever happened, the team of 6 men had no reason to believe they were in any danger. They assumed it was a routine maintenance procedure. Antonio's job that afternoon was not to operate the water cannons. He was there purely to help clean up any debris or water that spilled onto the floor during the operation. He stood about 10 to 15 feet back from the open doghouse door, simply watching the other 5 men work. The scale of the danger surrounding them was immense. Directly above their heads was a 12-story oven filled with burning coal, superheated steam, and a massive, growing pool of molten, liquid lava that was held back by nothing but a temporary plug of cooled slag. The team successfully drained the water chamber and opened the heavy doghouse door. The 5 men took turns aiming the heavy water cannons through the opening, trying to blast the blockage loose. Antonio stood back, waiting for his turn to sweep up the mess. But as they worked, the active boiler above them continued to melt coal ash, creating more and more liquid slag. Because the drainage hole was plugged, this molten lava kept building up, growing heavier and heavier with every passing second. 20 minutes into the operation, the immense weight of the liquid slag finally became too much. The molten lava burst through the plug, creating a massive opening. Thousands of gallons of red-hot liquid slag came rushing down from the boiler. It hit the back wall of the empty, dry cooling tank and instantly deflected outward, shooting out of the open doghouse door like a massive tidal wave of molten fire. In a fraction of a second, the 6 men were engulfed in a wave of liquid slag that was burning at over 1,000 degrees. The molten substance flooded the floor, covering a 40-foot area in 6 inches of glowing liquid lava. When a person tries to run through mud or water, their progress is slow, but they can still move. But when these men tried to run, the physical reality was horrifying. The moment they stepped into the slag, their shoes instantly melted. With the next step, their skin and muscles melted, and their bones fused with the liquid slag. They were literally being consumed by the molten rock from the feet up. Antonio tried to run, but he fell forward, collapsing onto the sea of liquid fire. As he lay on his side, his body burning and melting, he managed to reach into his pocket with his one free hand, pull out his cell phone, and dial his mother's number. She didn't answer in time, so he left a voicemail. In a weak, agonizing voice, he gasped, "Mom, Mom, I'm burning!" "Please, call the cops." "Please, Mom." In the backway of the recording, his mother could hear the terrifying, low hissing sound of steam and molten slag continuing to pour out of the boiler. 5 of the 6 men on the maintenance team, including Antonio, died from their horrific injuries. Tampa Electric Company was later hit with massive safety violations and eventually paid out large financial settlements to the families of the deceased workers. Our 4th story takes us to the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Sea in the late 1970s. It is a story about a highly specialized and incredibly dangerous profession, saturation diving. Most people who enjoy recreational scuba diving know that you cannot simply dive down to great depths, spend time exploring, and then swim straight back up to the surface. When a diver breathes compressed air from a scuba tank, they are inhaling a mixture of oxygen and inert gases, usually nitrogen and helium. While the body consumes the oxygen, the inert gases are absorbed directly into the diver's bloodstream where they remain. If a diver ascends too quickly, the sudden drop in pressure causes these dissolved gases to rapidly expand, forming bubbles in their blood and tissues, much like opening a shaken bottle of soda. This condition is known as decompression sickness, or more commonly, the bends. At best, the bends can cause excruciating pain in the joints and muscles. At worst, it can cause paralysis or instant death. To prevent the bends, divers must ascend very slowly, performing planned pauses called decompression stops at various depths. This allows the inert gases to safely diffuse out of their blood and be exhaled. The deeper a diver goes, the more decompression stops they must make, and the longer those stops will take. For example, if a diver were to descend to a depth of 2,000 feet, it would take over 33 hours of continuous, gradual decompression to safely return to the surface pressure. In the offshore oil and gas industry, companies need divers to perform heavy construction, welding, and demolition on underwater structures located hundreds or even thousands of feet below the surface. Because it is highly inefficient to have a diver spend days decompressing after a single hour of work, the industry developed saturation diving. Saturation divers, or SAT divers, live in a highly pressurized environment for weeks at a time. They reside inside a small cramped pressure chamber on board a dive support ship or an oil rig. This chamber is pressurized to match the exact pressure of the deep ocean floor where they will be working. The living conditions inside these chambers are incredibly tight and uncomfortable, often resembling the interior of a tiny metallic submarine with just a few bunk beds and a basic toilet. Once the divers enter the chamber and the heavy steel doors are sealed, they remain in this pressurized state for up to a month, keeping their bodies completely saturated with inert gases. Connected to the side of this living chamber is another pressurized capsule called a dive bell. When it is time for a shift to begin, 2 divers will put on their heavy, specialized dive suits inside the living chamber and crawl through a hatch directly into the dive bell. They seal the hatch behind them, and crew members on the deck of the ship disconnect the dive bell from the living chamber. Using a massive crane, the heavy steel dive bell is lowered over the side of the ship and down into the dark ocean depths. Once the bell reaches the working depth, the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure of the surrounding water. This allows the divers to open a circular hatch on the bottom of the bell known as the wet pot without any water entering the capsule. One diver will slide through the hatch into the open ocean to perform the work, while the second diver remains inside the bell to monitor their partner's life support systems and communications. The working diver is connected to the dive bell by a thick bundle of hoses and cables called an umbilical, which provides them with breathing gas, electricity for their helmet lights, communication lines, and a constant flow of hot water to keep their suit warm in the freezing ocean. When the shift is over, the diver climbs back into the bell, seals the bottom hatch, and the bell is winched back up to the ship. It is reconnected to the living chamber, allowing the divers to crawl inside to eat and sleep until their next shift. At the very end of their month-long tour, the divers will undergo one continuous multi-day decompression process inside the living chamber to safely return their bodies to normal atmospheric pressure. While saturation diving is an incredibly efficient way to perform deep-sea work, it is widely considered one of the most dangerous and psychologically demanding jobs in the world. Down past 700 feet, the ocean is in a state of perpetual pitch-black darkness. The water temperature is hovering just above freezing. If the hot water supply flowing to a diver's suit were to fail for even a few minutes, hypothermia would set in almost instantly, leading to death. The divers carry powerful flashlights, but the water near the seabed is often so thick with kicked-up mud and sediment that shining a light is like trying to drive through a dense fog. They can rarely see more than a few inches in front of their faces. SAT divers often report the terrifying sensation of feeling the water around them suddenly move violently in the darkness. They will turn their lights around, but the zero visibility means they can't see what caused the disturbance. They just have to accept that a massive deep-sea predator is swimming nearby, checking them out. Sometimes, large fish will swim directly into the beam of a diver's light and press themselves close to the diver's body. They aren't trying to be friendly. They are using the diver as a shield, trying to hide from a larger predator that is lurking just outside the light's reach. Experienced SAT divers learn to manage the extreme isolation and fear. But there is one specific emergency that every single saturation diver dreads more than anything else: a lost bell. While the divers are working on the seabed, the heavy dive bell hangs suspended in the water column nearby, connected to the surface ship by a thick steel cable. If this cable were to snap, the heavy dive bell would plunge to the bottom of the ocean, dragging the working divers along with it by their umbilicals. If the divers survived the violent crash to the sea floor, they would be trapped inside a freezing, dark steel ball hundreds of feet below the surface, with no way to escape. Their only hope would be that a rescue team could locate them and pull them up before their limited emergency supplies of oxygen ran out or they froze to death. On the 7th of August, 1979, a 31-year-old saturation diver named Richard Walker was living inside a pressure chamber on board a dive support vessel in the North Sea. Richard had been in saturation for 10 long days, and he was completely exhausted. He was incredibly homesick and wanted nothing more than to return to his home in England to see his wife and his 15-month-old daughter. That evening, just before his scheduled shift, Richard wrote a simple, heartbreaking entry in his personal journal: "Dear God, I just want to get out." Shortly after writing those words, Richard and his diving partner, Victor Gill, put on their heavy diving gear and crawled into the dive bell. Before the bell was lifted by the crane, a deck worker noticed that the emergency location transponder mounted to the outside of the bell, which was designed to beam the bell's exact coordinates to the surface in an emergency, had become loose. Rather than delaying the dive to repair the mount, the decision was made to simply remove the transponder entirely. The bell was then swung over the side of the ship and lowered 485 feet down into the cold, dark waters of the North Sea. Once they reached the working depth, Richard and Victor opened the bottom hatch, and Richard slid out into the water to begin working on an underwater oil pipeline structure. A few hours into the shift, at around 2:45 a.m., Richard was working on the seabed when he heard a strange, heavy, metallic scraping sound behind him. He turned around and saw that the dive bell, which should have been hanging perfectly vertical, was tilting sharply on its side. At that exact moment, the radio in his helmet crackled to life. Victor, speaking from inside the bell, told Richard that there was a major emergency and that he needed to get back inside the dive bell immediately. Richard scrambled back to the bell, climbed through the bottom hatch, and sealed it shut. Over the radio, the surface crew explained that the main steel winch cable holding the dive bell had completely slipped off its drum. The main cable was gone, but the dive bell was still connected to the ship by the umbilical, a thick bundle of hoses and wires that provided their air, hot water, power, and communications. The umbilical was never designed to hold the weight of the massive steel dive bell. But at that moment, it was the only thing preventing the bell from sinking. The crew on the ship decided that their only option was to try and use the umbilical to slowly reel the dive bell back up to the surface. But the moment they began to apply tension, the heavy umbilical snapped under the immense weight. With its connection severed, the dive bell plummeted 50 feet through the darkness, slamming violently into the muddy ocean floor. Under normal safety regulations, a dive bell was equipped with a large heavy weight called a clump weight suspended beneath it. In an emergency, the divers inside could pull a manual release lever to drop the clump weight, making the bell buoyant so it would float back to the surface on its own. But Richard and Victor's diving company had cut corners to save money. Instead of using a releasable clump weight, they had bolted heavy lead weights directly to the frame of the dive bell itself. When the bell hit the seafloor, it sank deep into the thick mud, completely blocking the bottom escape hatch. Richard and Victor were trapped inside. With the umbilical severed, the bell had lost all power, heat, and communications. They were plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness, and the internal temperature began to drop rapidly toward freezing. They had a small emergency supply of oxygen, but it would only last for a limited time. All they could do was sit in the freezing dark and pray for a rescue. About 30 minutes after the accident, another dive support ship in the area arrived at the scene to assist. But because they had not been prepared for an active dive, it took their crew over 3 hours to get their rescue divers suited up and into the water. Even worse, because Richard and Victor's dive bell had its location transponder removed before the dive, the rescue divers had no way to track its position. They had to search the dark, muddy seabed blindly. After an hour of searching, a rescue diver finally spotted the dark shape of the lost bell. He swam over and shined his flashlight through one of the thick acrylic viewing ports. Inside, Richard and Victor shined their own emergency flashlights back, giving the rescue diver an enthusiastic thumbs up. They were cold, but they were alive and unharmed. The rescue diver communicated the good news back to the surface. Everyone on the ship felt an immense wave of relief. The company immediately called Richard's wife, telling her that there had been an accident, but that her husband had been found alive and would be brought up shortly. But the rescue was far from over. The surface ship carrying the rescue team was struggling to maintain its position in the rough North Sea waves, drifting back and forth. This made it incredibly difficult for the rescue divers to work on the seabed. For the next 2 hours, the divers desperately tried to attach a new recovery cable to the top of the lost bell. Through the window, they watched as Richard and Victor's condition began to deteriorate. The thumbs up and smiles were gone. The two men were shivering violently in the extreme cold, their breathing shallow as the oxygen levels inside the cramped bell began to deplete. Finally, at 9 p.m., 6 hours after the bell had first hit the bottom, the rescue divers managed to secure a new cable to the bell. Before giving the signal to hoist, a diver shined his light through the porthole one more time. Richard and Victor were sitting side by side, their heads resting in their hands. They looked incredibly weak, but they gave a slow, tired wave. The surface crew began winching the heavy cable. But as the dive bell was lifted off the muddy seabed, the sudden tension caused the new recovery cable to snap. The bell crashed back down into the mud. Up on the surface, a heavy silence fell over the crew. They knew that time was running out. Rescue divers went back down into the water. When they reached the bell, they shined their lights inside. Richard and Victor were still alive, but they were no longer looking at the window or trying to communicate. They were sitting slumped over, staring at the floor. It was clear they had realized that they were not going to be saved. For several more hours, the rescue team worked frantically in the dark, cold water, trying to thread a third cable through the bell's lifting eye. Each time a diver checked through the window, the two men inside had slumped lower and lower in their seats. Eventually, the third cable was successfully secured, and the winch slowly lifted the lost dive bell all the way back to the surface, swinging it onto the deck of the ship. But when the crew finally opened the heavy steel hatch, they found that both Richard Walker and Victor Gill had tragically succumbed to hypothermia and asphyxiation. Our fifth and final story takes us to the campus of Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. It was January of 2007. Purdue is a highly prestigious American university, famous for its rigorous academic programs and its competitive athletic teams. Among the thousands of students returning to campus for the spring semester was a 19-year-old freshman named Wade Steffi. Wade was an exceptionally bright young man who was studying aviation technology on a prestigious full academic scholarship. He was tall, athletic, handsome, and incredibly popular, known for his friendly demeanor and his passion for flying. At around 7:20 p.m. on Friday, the 12th of January 2007, Wade walked into the Ford Dining Hall, which was one of the main dining areas on campus. It was the very first Friday of the new semester, and the dining hall was packed with students who were laughing, talking, and making plans for the weekend. Wade sat down at a table with a group of close friends, and they spent the next hour chatting about their classes and their weekend plans. At around 8:20 p.m., Wade stood up, said goodbye to his friends, cleared his tray, and walked out the door. He turned right and walked a very short distance to Owen Hall, a large student dormitory located next to the dining hall. Wade didn't live in Owen Hall. His own room was located in a different dorm called Cary Quad West, which was on the other side of the dining hall. But Wade had several friends who lived in Owen Hall, and he wanted to visit them. He went up to his friend's room, where a small group of students had gathered to hang out and have a few drinks before going out. Wade joined them, having a couple of alcoholic drinks and enjoying the relaxed, fun atmosphere. At around 9:30 p.m., Wade and his friends left Owen Hall and walked about half a mile off campus to a large party being held at a local fraternity house. The party was loud and crowded, and Wade spent several hours socializing and having a good time. But around midnight, he realized he had a problem. The temperature outside had dropped significantly, and he remembered that he had left his warm winter jacket back in his friend's room at Owen Hall. Wade decided to leave the party and walk back to Owen Hall to retrieve his jacket before heading to his own dorm. But there was a major obstacle. On Purdue's campus, all the student dormitories were locked late at night for safety. The only way to get inside was to swipe a student ID card that was registered to that specific building, or to have a resident open the door for you. As Wade began his walk back to Owen Hall, he pulled out his cell phone and tried to call his friends so they could come down and let him in. Between 12 a.m. and 12:30 a.m., Wade made 6 different phone calls. But because he was highly intoxicated, his coordination was off. 4 of the calls he dialed were wrong numbers. The strangers who answered had no idea who he was or what he wanted, and they quickly hung up. Wade did manage to dial the correct numbers for 2 of his friends who lived in Owen Hall, but both of them had their phones on silent and did not answer. At around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at the locked front doors of Owen Hall. He put his phone away and began knocking loudly on the heavy glass doors, hoping someone inside would hear him. A student who lived in Owen Hall happened to be walking through the lobby and heard the knocking. He walked over to the glass doors and looked out at Wade. The student didn't know Wade, and Wade didn't know him. After observing Wade for a moment, the student decided that Wade looked far too intoxicated to be let into the building late at night. Fearing he might cause trouble, the student refused to unlock the door, turned around, and walked away. Wade stood at the glass doors for a minute, knocking a few more times, but he eventually realized nobody was going to let him in through the front entrance. In his drunken state, he was determined to get his jacket, so he decided to walk around the exterior of the massive brick building to look for another way inside. Wade walked around to the dark left side of Owen Hall. As he searched the exterior walls, he spotted a metal door. Even though there were no warning signs or keep-out placards posted on the door, it was very obvious that this door was not intended for student use. The door was not located at ground level. Instead, it was built into the side of the building at basement level, inside a deep, rectangular concrete pit. A heavy metal safety railing was installed along the edge of the grass to prevent students and pedestrians from accidentally tripping and falling into the concrete pit. The only way to reach this door was to climb over the metal safety railing and jump down several feet into the concrete pit, landing on a slab of cement directly in front of the door. The door was supposed to be locked at all times, accessible only to maintenance staff who carried a master key. But when Wade, in his highly intoxicated state, climbed over the safety railing, jumped down into the pit, and pulled on the door handle, the door swung open. The lock had failed, or a worker had forgotten to secure it. Wade looked inside, but the space beyond the door was absolutely pitch black. He couldn't see a thing, but he could hear the deep, heavy hum of large electrical machinery running somewhere in the darkness. Wade believed that if he could just get inside this basement room, he would eventually find a stairwell or an interior door that would lead him up into the main corridors of Owen Hall, where he could go to his friend's room. Because the room was completely dark, Wade was worried that once he stepped inside and the heavy door closed behind him, he would be trapped in the pitch-black space, unable to find his way out. To prevent this, Wade slipped off one of his athletic shoes and wedged it tightly into the doorframe, propping the heavy metal door open so that a sliver of light from the outside could shine into the room. With his shoe keeping the door open, Wade stepped into the dark room. He had only taken a few steps when his body bumped into a massive, solid metal structure. Because of the absolute darkness, he couldn't see what it was, but he could feel its cold metallic surface, and he could hear that this specific machine was the source of the loud, buzzing vibration echoing through the room. Wade decided to feel his way around the massive machine, hoping to find a path that led deeper into the building. He began shuffling to his left, keeping his hands pressed against the metal surface of the machine to guide himself. But the machine was incredibly wide, and as Wade reached its left edge, he realized that the space between the side of the machine and the solid brick wall of the room was extremely narrow. There was barely enough room for a person to fit. But Wade, driven by his single-minded goal of finding his jacket, turned his body sideways. With his back pressed against the brick wall and his chest facing the side of the buzzing machine, he began to squeeze his way into the tight gap. As he shuffled sideways through the narrow space in the pitch-black room, his hands were held up near his chest and face to protect himself. Suddenly, Wade lost his footing slightly. He didn't fall to the ground because his body was tightly wedged between the wall and the machine, but as he reached out with his hands to steady himself, his left hand brushed against the side of the machine. By a tragic, horrible stroke of bad luck, Wade's left ring finger slid directly into a tiny circular opening in the metal casing of the machine. The opening was only about 2 inches deep. The dark room Wade had entered was actually Owen Hall's high-voltage electrical vault, and the massive, buzzing structure he was squeezing past was one of 6 massive industrial electrical transformers that powered the entire dormitory. The purpose of these transformers was to take the extremely high-voltage electricity coming directly from the city's main power grid and step it down to a lower, safer voltage that could be distributed to the student rooms and study halls. While the exterior of these massive transformers was heavily insulated to prevent accidental electrocution, there were certain physical components that could not be covered. One of these components was a high-voltage electrical conductor located at the very back of the small 2-inch opening that Wade's finger had just slipped into. The moment the tip of Wade's finger made contact with the conductor, a massive electrical charge of between 2,000 and 4,000 volts instantly surged through his body. For comparison, the electric chairs used in state executions typically use around 2,000 volts to terminate a life. Wade died instantly. Because his body was tightly wedged in the extremely narrow gap between the transformer and the brick wall, his physical body did not collapse to the floor. Instead, Wade remained standing in a semi-upright position, his left finger still wedged inside the high-voltage opening. For the next 2 months, the massive electrical current continued to flow through his body every single second of every single day. When Wade's roommate returned to campus on Tuesday, January 16th, after a long holiday weekend, he immediately noticed that Wade was not in their room. He tried calling and texting him, but there was no response. After checking with other students on their floor and realizing nobody had seen Wade since Friday night, the worried roommate called Wade's parents. When they confirmed they hadn't heard from him either, the family contacted the Purdue University Police Department to report Wade missing. The police launched an immediate, massive investigation. They contacted Wade's cellular service provider and managed to determine that his cell phone was still active and transmitting a signal from somewhere on the Purdue campus, though the technology at the time was not precise enough to pinpoint his exact location. A massive campus-wide search was launched, involving hundreds of police officers, student volunteers, and professional search and rescue teams. The university's equestrian club even brought out their horses to search the dense woods surrounding the campus. On January 20th, 4 days into the search, a search team found Wade's missing shoe sitting in the concrete pit outside the basement maintenance door of Owen Hall. At some point after Wade had entered the room, the heavy door had shifted, and the shoe had slipped out of the frame, allowing the door to slam shut and lock. The police officers who found the shoe knew it belonged to Wade, and they realized that the door led into the basement electrical vault. To search the room, they did not climb into the pit. Instead, they walked inside Owen Hall, went down to the basement, and used a key to open an interior access door that led into the vault from the hallway. But when the officers opened the interior door, they simply stood in the doorway and shined their flashlights into the dark room. From their angle, the massive bulk of the electrical transformers completely blocked their view of the narrow gap along the far wall. They didn't see anyone, so they assumed the room was empty. They closed the door, locked it, and continued searching elsewhere. After nearly a month of searching with zero leads, the official search for Wade Steffi was called off. On the 19th of March 2007, nearly 2 months after Wade had vanished, a university maintenance worker was working in the student laundry room in the basement of Owen Hall. As he was loading a machine, he heard a strange, loud popping sound echoing through the basement. The worker assumed the sound was coming from one of the industrial washing machines or dryers, perhaps a loose coin or a metal zipper hitting the inside of a spinning metal drum. He walked around the laundry room, placing his ear against each machine, but they were all running smoothly. A moment later, he heard the loud popping sound again, but this time he realized it was coming from the hallway outside. He walked out of the laundry room and stood in the corridor. The basement was quiet, but then the loud pop echoed again, coming from directly behind the heavy locked metal door opposite the laundry room. The worker pulled out his master ring of keys, unlocked the door, and stepped into the dark electrical vault. As he walked into the room, he was hit by a terrible, foul odor. He shined his flashlight around the massive transformers, following the sound and the smell, and eventually discovered Wade's body wedged in the narrow gap. The investigation revealed that over the 2 months Wade's body had remained wedged against the transformer, his physical tissues had gradually dried out. Eventually, the electrical current could no longer flow smoothly through his body, and the thousands of volts of electricity began arcing through the air, snapping from his skin to the nearby metal grounding wires. The loud popping sound the maintenance worker had heard was the sound of massive electrical sparks jumping through the air. The discovery was absolutely devastating for Wade's family, his friends, and the entire Purdue community. Because the university had failed to ensure that the exterior door to the high-voltage electrical vault was properly locked, Purdue University was found to be highly negligent. The university eventually reached a legal settlement with Wade's family, agreeing to pay them $500,000, and they established a permanent academic scholarship in Wade's name to honor his memory. These 5 tragic stories remind us of a sobering truth about our existence. The line between a normal, happy life and a sudden, unimaginable tragedy is often incredibly thin. The people in these stories did not set out to lose their lives. They were mayors, popular high school athletes, loving fathers-to-be, dedicated professionals, and brilliant college students. They were people with families who loved them, friends who cherished them, and futures filled with promise. But in a single moment, a simple decision to seek an adventure, to take a shortcut, or to ignore a safety warning led them into environments where there was no room for error. Their stories leave us with a haunting sense of loss and a powerful reminder to cherish every moment, to respect the boundaries put in place to protect us, and to never take our safety for reference. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. A man went into the Wyoming wilderness to do something he had done many times before. Go hunting. But within a matter of hours, something would happen out there that still cannot be fully explained today. A rifle would fire, but the bullet would behave in a way that defies physics. The man would black out, and when he came back, nothing would ever fully make sense again. What he later described would become one of the most disturbing and controversial unexplained cases ever recorded in the American wilderness. On the afternoon of the 25th of October 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon pointed his work truck towards the vast expanse of the Medicine Bow National Forest in southern Wyoming. Carl worked on an oil rig, a tough job for a tough man, and he'd managed to get off a little early that day. His plan was simple and one he cherished: to go elk hunting. He wasn't just going anywhere, though. He'd heard whispers from other hunters about a specific spot, a place called McMarty Canyon, where the elk were said to be plentiful. As the truck ate up the miles on the paved road, Carl felt the tension from the work week just melt away. He looked out at the endless evergreen trees, the distant mountains capped with early season snow, and a deep sense of calm settled over him. This was his element. Carl was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person who felt more at home in the quiet of the wilderness than anywhere else. For him, solitude wasn't something to be avoided, it was something to be embraced. For a little while, he was just a man and the wilderness, driving along, enjoying the peace. Eventually, the smooth pavement ended. The road gave way to a long, rocky trail that snaked its way deeper into the forest. Now, this truck wasn't his. It belonged to his company, and the last thing he wanted was to damage it trying to navigate this rough terrain. So, he made a practical decision. He pulled over to the side of the trail, shut off the engine, and got out. He gathered his rifle and his gear, locked up the truck, and started the rest of the journey on foot. The hike wasn't easy. The trail was not only covered in loose rocks that made every step a careful one, but it was also a steady uphill climb. It didn't take long for Carl to feel the strain. He started having trouble catching his breath. This wasn't just because of the exertion or the altitude. Years ago, Carl had survived a serious bout of tuberculosis. While he had recovered, the disease had left its mark, riddling his lungs with scar tissue. It was a constant reminder, a physical limitation that made strenuous activity a real challenge. But Carl was determined. He wasn't the type to give up easily. He just pushed on, taking it slow. Every few minutes, he'd stop, bend over with his hands on his knees, and just focus on pulling air into his protesting lungs. After about 30 minutes of this slow and steady climb, he noticed a change in the landscape. The dense trees began to thin out, and the sky opened up above him. He had finally arrived. He was standing at the edge of McMarty Canyon. The place had a unique feel to it. It was like standing in a giant, natural bowl. The floor of the canyon was mostly flat, covered in shrubs, patches of grass, and a few scattered trees. All around the edges, tall hills rose up, creating that distinct bowl-like impression. Carl stopped for a moment, taking it all in, letting his breathing return to normal. He scanned the area, his hunter's eyes searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw them. Straight across the canyon, grazing peacefully in the distance, was a group of 5 elk. He couldn't believe his luck. To arrive at a spot for the first time and immediately find what you're looking for, it was almost too good to be true. A surge of adrenaline cut through his fatigue. He immediately dropped into a stealthy crouch, using the sparse cover to his advantage. He began to move slowly, deliberately, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping a twig or scuffing a rock. His focus was entirely on the elk. When he finally felt he was within a reasonable shooting distance, he stopped. He slowly raised his rifle, the familiar weight of it a comfort in his hands. He settled the stock against his shoulder, brought his eye to the scope, and took aim at the largest elk in the group. He controlled his breathing, just like he'd done 1,000 times before. He let out half a breath and held it, his finger gently squeezing the trigger. And then he pulled it. But nothing happened. There was no deafening crack of the rifle, no powerful kick against his shoulder. There was just silence. It was as if the gun hadn't fired at all. He was confused for a second, thinking maybe the safety was on or the rifle had jammed. But then he saw something that completely defied all logic, something that his mind simply could not process. At the exact same moment, a dizzying wave of vertigo washed over him. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He felt himself falling, a strange, weightless sensation, and then everything went black. The next thing Carl was aware of was a violent shaking. Someone was shaking him back and forth, trying to rouse him. His eyes fluttered open, blinking against a darkness he didn't recognize. A pounding headache throbbed behind his eyes, and a thick fog of confusion clouded his thoughts. He realized he was sitting upright, but he wasn't on the ground in the canyon. He was back in the driver's seat of his work truck. He looked out the windows, but the surroundings were all wrong. This wasn't where he had parked. The trees were different, the ground was different. The shaking started again, more insistent this time, and a voice cut through the darkness, saying his name. He looked up and could make out the silhouettes of two men standing outside his open door. He didn't know them. They were trying to ask him questions to find out what was going on, but when Carl tried to answer, his mouth felt strange and numb. The words that came out were a jumbled, garbled mess. He couldn't form a coherent sentence. The two men exchanged a look, clearly realizing they weren't going to get any answers from him in this state. They gave up trying to talk to him, and instead, they carefully lifted him out of the truck. He felt their arms supporting him as they carried him over to their own vehicle. Through the haze, he heard one of them mention a hospital. Soon, he was in the back of their car, of two engines started, and they were driving off into the night. And once again, Carl's world faded to black. About 30 minutes later, just around midnight on October 26th, Carl's wife, Marjorie, burst through the door of a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital. The sterile smell and the quiet beeping of machines filled the air. And there, in the bed, was Carl. He was hooked up to an IV, with various monitors tracking his vitals. A nurse stood beside him, checking his chart. Marjorie saw that his eyes were open, but they had a distant, unfocused look to them. He was staring at the ceiling, but it was clear he wasn't really seeing it. As Marjorie stood there, frozen in the doorway, trying to process the scene, the nurse noticed her. The nurse gestured towards Marjorie and then turned to Carl. She asked him a simple question, "Do you know who this is?" Carl slowly turned his head and looked directly at his wife. But there was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of familiarity. He just stared blankly at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head and said, "No." Earlier that evening, Marjorie had been at home, growing more and more anxious. Carl was usually so reliable. When he said he'd be home by a certain time, he was home. But the hours had ticked by, and there was still no sign of him. Her worry eventually got the best of her, and she called the sheriff's department. She explained that her husband had gone hunting in McMarty Canyon and was long overdue. She asked if they could just send someone out to check on him. So, 2 deputies had driven out into the national forest. And they were the ones who found him, passed out and unresponsive in his truck. They were the 2 men who had shaken him awake and brought him to the hospital. But the story they told was bizarre. It wasn't just that they had found Carl unconscious. It was where they had found him. His truck was located a full 3 miles away from the main road, stuck deep in a muddy bog. And the strangest part of all was that there were no tire tracks. Not a single one leading to or from the vehicle. It was as if the multi-ton truck had just been dropped from the sky right into the middle of the mud. But at that moment, neither the deputies nor Marjorie were too concerned about the mystery of the truck. Their focus was entirely on Carl, who was lying in a hospital bed, a complete stranger to his own life. The doctor had spoken to Marjorie, explaining that Carl was severely disoriented and appeared to be suffering from profound amnesia. He couldn't remember his own name, let alone what had happened to him out in that canyon. The medical team had done everything they could. They ran a battery of tests, including X-rays and brain scans, searching for any sign of a head injury, a stroke, or anything that could explain his condition. But they found nothing. In fact, according to all the tests, he was in perfect physical health. There was no injury, no medical reason for his amnesia or his disorientation. The staff told Marjorie that since they couldn't find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. For the time being, all they could do was keep him under observation. Marjorie sank into a chair beside her husband's bed, her mind reeling. Nothing made sense. She was about to ask the nurse another question when Carl's body suddenly tensed up. He started looking around the room frantically, his eyes darting from one corner to the other as if he was searching for something desperately important. Then he started to speak, his voice agitated. "Where are my pills?" he asked, to no one in particular. "Where are they?" Marjorie had no idea what he was talking about. Carl didn't take any regular medication. The nurse was just as confused. Trying to soothe him, Marjorie reached out to take his hand. But the moment her skin touched his, Carl recoiled. He yanked his hand away and stared at her with a look of alarm, as if a complete stranger had just tried to touch him. It was a heartbreaking moment for Marjorie, seeing the man she loved look at her with such fear and confusion. 2 days passed. Carl slowly began to surface from the fog. He started to remember small things. He remembered his own name. And, to Marjorie's immense relief, he finally remembered who she was. Since all the medical tests continued to show that he was physically unharmed, the hospital decided to discharge him. The doctors theorized that perhaps being in a familiar environment back in his own home would help jog his memory and bring him back to normal. But when they got home, it quickly became obvious that Carl was not okay. He wasn't getting better. He was incredibly quiet, which was completely out of character for the usually talkative man. He would sit for hours, just staring into space. And when he did speak, it was often in that same frantic, nonsensical way he had in the hospital. He would suddenly get agitated, looking around the house, asking about his pills. He also started saying something new, something equally strange. He kept telling Marjorie that someone had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to question him gently. "What pills, Carl?" "What do you mean someone took your elk?" But he couldn't explain. It was like he had these fragments of memory floating in his mind, but no context to put them in. He seemed just as confused by his own thoughts as she was. It was as if he was a prisoner in his own mind, haunted by memories that didn't make sense. Then, a few days after they returned from the hospital, something shifted. Carl came to Marjorie and told her he remembered something. A new specific memory from the hunting trip had surfaced. He described being in McMarty Canyon, seeing the elk, and raising his rifle. He told her again about pulling the trigger and how there was no sound and no kickback. But then he added the detail that he hadn't been able to articulate before. He said he saw the bullet leave the barrel of the rifle, but it was moving in extreme slow motion. He said it was like watching something move through thick syrup. He could see it tumbling end over end as it traveled slowly across the canyon. And then, he said, the bullet seemed to hit an invisible wall in midair. It just stopped dead. And then, the truly impossible part happened. He watched as the bullet seemed to turn itself inside out, flattening into a strange metallic disc before it simply fell to the ground. He said that as he watched the flattened bullet fall, he felt himself fall with it, and that's when he blacked out. Marjorie listened to the story, and her first thought was that it had to be a hallucination. Maybe his mind, desperate to fill in the huge blank spot in his memory, had simply invented this bizarre and impossible scenario. It was the only explanation that made any sense. But a few days later, that changed. Marjorie was doing laundry, going through the clothes Carl had been wearing on the day of his hunting trip. As she checked the pockets of his jacket before putting it in the wash, her fingers closed around something small, hard, and metallic. She pulled it out and looked at it in her palm. It was a round, flat, metal disc. At first, she had no idea what it could be. But then, her husband's strange story echoed in her mind: the bullet that flipped inside out and flattened. She stared at the object in her hand, a cold chill running down her spine. It looked exactly like a bullet that had somehow been turned inside out and pressed completely flat. She couldn't believe it. This discovery changed everything for Marjorie. She was now convinced that something truly extraordinary had happened to her husband in that canyon. It wasn't a fall or a medical episode. It was something else. Determined to find answers, she and Carl ended up in the office of a man named Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a psychology professor at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Sprinkle was not a typical psychologist. He was a firm believer in the power of hypnosis, specifically its ability to help people access repressed memories. He believed that traumatic events could be locked away in the mind, and hypnosis was the key to unlocking them. This was exactly what Carl and Marjorie believed had happened to Carl. The memory was in there somewhere. They just needed help finding it. In the professor's quiet office, Marjorie sat on a couch, watching intently as Dr. Sprinkle began the session. He instructed Carl to close his eyes, to let his head hang down towards his chest, and to focus only on the sound of his own breathing. In and out, in and out. After several minutes, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head. Carl did, but his eyes remained closed. He was in a deep state of hypnosis. Then Dr. Sprinkle asked the question. Carl, I want you to tell me what happened on October 25th when you went hunting in McMurdy Canyon. With his eyes still shut, Carl began to speak. His voice was steady and clear, and he began to tell a story so incredible that it left both Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle completely speechless. Under hypnosis, Carl recounted the events just as he had remembered them before, but this time he didn't stop when he blacked out. He said that after he watched the bullet flatten and fall, he too fell to the ground. But he was only unconscious for a moment. When he opened his eyes, he was still lying in the grass, but he was no longer alone. Standing over him was a tall, dark figure. It was wearing a tight-fitting one-piece suit, like a scuba diver's wetsuit. He said the figure was shaped like a human, but it wasn't human. Its skin was a pale yellowish color. It had very small eyes, no visible ears, and its mouth was just a thin slit with no lips. Protruding from its forehead were two antennae. One of its arms ended in a flat stump, but the other had a strange attachment at the end, something that looked almost like a power drill. Then the creature looked down at him, and in perfect, unaccented English, it asked, "How are you?" Carl said he was so shocked to hear it speak that he just automatically replied, "Pretty good." The being seemed to accept this answer. It told Carl that its name was also One, and that it came from a planet that was 163,000 light-years from Earth. It assured Carl that it had no intention of harming him. In fact, it said it wanted to help him. Then, using its arm with the drill-like attachment, Also One reached into a pocket on its suit and pulled out a small packet. Inside were 4 pills. It told Carl that these pills would heal him. It offered one to Carl, and for some reason he couldn't explain, Carl felt no fear. He simply took the pill and swallowed it. After he'd taken it, Also One asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl, still in a state of strange calm, just said, "Sure." Also One helped Carl to his feet. As soon as he was standing, Carl saw a vehicle nearby that he hadn't noticed before. It was shaped like a perfect cube. In the next instant, without walking or moving, Carl said he was suddenly inside the vehicle. Also One was there with him, along with 2 other similar-looking beings. And, to his astonishment, so were the 5 elk he had been hunting. They were in a separate compartment behind a clear wall, like a transparent pen. Carl was sitting in a chair, as were the three beings. He then felt a powerful force press him back into his seat, the feeling of incredible acceleration. But less than a minute later, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. Also, Ballen turned to him and said, "We're home." The next thing he knew, he was standing outside the vehicle. The air was frigid and the sky was a deep, starless black. The landscape was utterly alien. It was rocky and desolate, with no trees, no grass, no sign of any life at all. In the distance, he saw a single, massive tower, a metallic structure that reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. A light at the top of it was so intensely bright that it hurt his eyes to look at. Also, one led Carl, the other two beings, and the elk towards a door at the base of the tower. The door slid open silently, revealing not a room, but a space that looked like the inside of a large elevator. The entire group stepped inside, and they began to ascend. When the elevator stopped and the doors opened again, they were in a small, windowless room with metallic walls. On the floor were several raised platforms. Also, one directed the elk onto one of the platforms and then told Carl to stand on another one. Carl did as he was told. As soon as he was in place, a complex-looking device emerged from one of the walls. It began to move around him, starting at his head and working its way down to his feet, scanning him. He was vaguely aware that the elk were being scanned in the same way. When the process was finished, the device made a soft beeping sound and retracted back into the wall. Also, one looked over at Carl and said, "The elk are what we needed, but you're not. We're going to take you back to Earth now." And just like that, Carl said the next thing he knew, he was back in his work truck. The world was dark, and he was being shaken awake by the two sheriff's deputies. Back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Carl finished his story. "Doctor." Sprinkle snapped his fingers, and Carl's eyes opened. The hypnosis was over. He looked around, a bit dazed, as if waking from a long dream. The three of them sat in complete silence, the air thick with the weight of Carl's unbelievable tale. As wild as it sounded, there were several undeniable physical facts about Carl's case that, up until that point, had been completely unexplainable. And the story he told under hypnosis, as impossible as it seemed, accounted for every single one of them. First, there was the matter of the truck. It was found 3 miles from where he parked it, stuck in a bog with no tire tracks. Investigators had been stumped. There was no conventional way for that vehicle to have gotten there. But if it had been transported, as Carl's story suggested, that would explain its impossible location. Second, there was the bullet. When Marjorie had a ballistics expert examine the flattened metal disc, they were baffled. They said there was no known force on Earth, no type of impact or pressure that could cause a bullet to deform in that specific way, to be essentially turned inside out. It defied the laws of physics as we know them. And the third, and perhaps most compelling piece of evidence, was found in Carl's own body. When the doctors at the hospital took x-rays of his chest, they found something medically impossible. For decades, Carl's lungs had been covered in thick scar tissue from his battle with tuberculosis. Those scars were on all his previous medical records. But on the new x-rays, they were gone. Completely vanished. The doctors had no explanation. It was as if his lungs had been miraculously healed. The story of also one giving him a pill that would heal him suddenly took on a chilling new significance. For decades, skeptics and researchers have picked apart Carl Higdon's story, trying to find a logical explanation for what happened that day. But no one ever has. No one has ever been able to offer a better explanation for the relocated truck, the physically impossible bullet, and the miraculous healing of his lungs. Because of this, the strange and unbelievable account of a Wyoming oil rigger remains one of the most credible and deeply unsettling alien abduction cases ever recorded. And to this day, there is still no clear explanation of what really happened to Carl Higdon in that forest. Some people believe it was a psychological breakdown. Others point to a series of coincidences that science is still struggling to fully explain. And a few people believe that it is something much more concerning than we are willing to accept. Because no matter how you look at it, three things remain true. A man ventures into the wilderness of Wyoming and returns with missing memories, a piece of metal that shouldn't exist, and a body has somehow been cured of a disease he had carried for decades. So the question is not just what happened to Carl Higdon. Are we really ready to know the answer? If you search for the most unbelievable war stories in history, there is one particular name that almost always appears at the very top of the list. It is a story of survival, determination, and a complete refusal to die, even when the human body has been pushed far past its absolute limits. To understand how this incredible story unfolded, we have to go back to South Texas in the year 1935. This was the year that a boy named Roy Benavidez was born. Roy did not have an easy childhood. When he was still a very young child, he lost both of his parents and became an orphan. He was sent to live with his uncle, and the family struggled constantly just to make ends meet. Times were incredibly tough, and by the time Roy was a young teenager, he had to make the difficult decision to drop out of school so he could work in the local beet and cotton fields. He spent long, grueling hours doing hard physical labor just to help support his family. But as the years went by, Roy knew he wanted something more out of life. He wanted to see the world and do something bigger. So, when he turned 18 years old, he decided to enlist in the United States Army. Shortly after joining, he volunteered for airborne school and was eventually assigned to the famous 82nd Airborne Division. Roy loved the Army. It was his entire life, and he was incredibly proud of his service. In October of 1964, Roy was sent to Vietnam as part of the first 125,000 Americans deployed to the conflict. While there, he was assigned to a highly classified operation that required him to dress up as an enemy combatant to gather intelligence deep in the jungle. During one of these missions, Roy was operating completely alone in a dense stretch of forest when he stepped directly on a landmine. The explosion was devastating, leaving him severely wounded and completely paralyzed on the jungle floor. Because the mission was classified and he was alone, there was no immediate help. Luckily, a squad of United States Marines came across his body a short time later. But because Roy was dressed in enemy clothing, the Marines assumed he was a fallen enemy soldier and almost walked right past him. Just before they left, one of the Marines decided to flip him over to check his face. That was when they discovered his American dog tags. They realized he was one of their own and immediately evacuated him to a military hospital. At the hospital, the doctors examined Roy and delivered some devastating news. They told him that his spinal injury was so severe that he would likely never walk again. The lead doctor advised him that he would have to be medically discharged from the Army. For Roy, this was worse than death. The Army was everything to him, and he desperately wanted to return to Vietnam to support his fellow soldiers. He pleaded with the doctors and nurses, begging them not to discharge him. He asked for some time to try to regain his strength. The medical staff agreed to a deal. They told him that if he was not walking within 1 year, they would have no choice but to medically retire him. Roy accepted the challenge, but he knew he could not do his physical therapy during the day when everyone was watching. So, every single night, after the doctors and nurses had left the ward and the other patients were asleep, Roy would begin his secret training. He would slide himself to the edge of his bed and let his limp body fall directly onto the hard floor. He could not use his legs, so he had to use his elbows and forearms to drag his body across the floor toward the wall. Once he reached the wall, he would pull himself up, trying to force his legs to support his weight. The pain in his spine was absolute agony, but he refused to stop. He would stand there, shaking and sweating, trying to take a step before collapsing back to the ground. He would drag himself back to his bed, climb in, and rest until the next night. He did this in complete secret, every single night for 6 long months. During the day, the doctors and nurses watched his recovery and were completely stunned. They called it a miracle, having no idea that Roy was putting himself through a brutal training routine every night. After 6 months, the medical staff agreed that he was fit to stay in the Army. However, because of his severe injuries, the Army insisted on assigning him to a desk job in North Carolina. They did not want to risk him getting hurt again in combat. Roy was devastated by this decision, but he did not give up. As soon as he arrived in North Carolina, he began training like a maniac. He ran miles, lifted weights, and got into the best shape of his life. His plan was to try out for the Special Forces and become a Green Beret, which is one of the hardest combat units in the world. After a few months, his superiors were amazed by his physical condition and allowed him to try out. A couple of months later, Roy Benavidez successfully completed the training and earned his Green Beret. In 1968, 4 years after he was nearly killed by the landmine, Roy was sent back to Vietnam for his second combat tour. On May 2nd of that year, Roy had a rare day off. He was spending his day attending a church service inside a small wooden shack on their base. While listening to the chaplain, Roy heard a frantic radio call coming from the communications table just outside the shack. The voice on the radio sounded absolutely desperate, screaming for help over a constant barrage of heavy gunfire and explosions. Roy ran outside to listen to the radio. He learned that a 12-man Army Special Forces team had been dropped deep into the jungle on a classified mission, and they had been completely ambushed by an entire North Vietnamese Army infantry battalion. This meant that 12 American soldiers, many of whom Roy knew personally, were trapped in the middle of the jungle, surrounded by over 1,000 enemy combatants. As Roy was listening to this horrifying transmission, he heard the sound of incoming helicopters. He ran over to the landing zone and watched as 3 helicopters touched down, all of them completely riddled with bullet holes and pouring smoke. Roy ran up to one of the door gunners, who was a 19-year-old kid. The young soldier looked completely dazed. Before he could speak, he collapsed directly into Roy's arms and died. He had been shot multiple times during a failed rescue attempt. The pilot of the helicopter was devastated about the death of his gunner, but he was also deeply frustrated that they had been unable to rescue the trapped men. He wanted to go back out and try again. Roy did not hesitate. He immediately volunteered to go with him, climbed into the helicopter, and they took off. But in his rush to help his friends, Roy made a major mistake. He forgot to grab his rifle. All he had on him was his Bowie knife and a canvas bag filled with medical supplies. Despite this, he told the pilot to fly toward the ambush site. The pilot flew the helicopter over the border into Cambodia, heading toward the dense stretch of jungle where the team was trapped. As they drew closer, heavy ground fire started coming out of the trees, hitting the side of the helicopter with loud metallic thuds. The pilot had to perform constant aggressive zigzag maneuvers just to avoid being shot down. Through the thick canopy, they spotted a column of colored smoke. The trapped team had set off a smoke grenade to mark their position. The pilot tried to guide the helicopter down to get close, but every time he got near, the enemy fire intensified dramatically. The helicopter was taking heavy hits, and the pilot told Roy that they had to turn back. Roy refused. He told the pilot to hover as low as possible over the treetops, and he would jump out. The pilot thought he was crazy, telling him he would be killed instantly without a weapon, but Roy insisted. The pilot brought the helicopter to a low hover about 100 yards away from the team's position, and without a second thought, Roy leaped out of the open door. He plunged directly into the thick jungle canopy without a parachute or a gun, crashing through the branches and hitting the hard ground. He quickly stood up and began running through the jungle toward the team's position. The enemy soldiers were so shocked to see an unarmed American running through the forest by himself that they hesitated to fire. But when they finally did open fire, Roy was hit in the face and the back of his head by bullets. A grenade detonated right behind him, sending shrapnel tearing into his back and legs. Despite the severe pain and the blood pouring down his face, Roy kept running until he finally reached the perimeter where the trapped Special Forces team was holding out. When Roy reached the team, he found them in an absolutely horrific situation. They were huddled behind a few large trees, trying their best to return fire, but bullets were flying in from every direction. Out of the 12 men, 4 were already dead, and the remaining 8 were all critically wounded. One of the most able-bodied men left alive had been shot in the head, losing one of his eyes completely, and his other eye was so swollen and filled with blood that he could barely see. He was fighting to stay conscious, blindly firing his weapon in the general direction of the enemy. Roy immediately ran over to him, pulled him down behind cover, and gave him a shot of morphine to ease his pain. Roy then repositioned the soldier, pointing him in the right direction and telling him exactly where to aim so he could continue to defend their position. Under a non-stop storm of enemy bullets, Roy got down on his stomach and began to low crawl through the dirt to reach each of the other wounded team members. One by one, he checked their wounds, administered morphine, and began the agonizing task of dragging them through the dirt to a slightly safer area that offered better cover. He had spotted a small clearing nearby and believed that if the helicopter pilot was brave enough, they might be able to land there to get the survivors out. During one of his trips back to the original ambush site to search for more survivors, Roy noticed something he had missed. He had not done a proper head count initially and did not realize that 2 members of the team had been completely cut off from the main group. They were pinned down in a small hollow, and the enemy was closing in on them. Roy knew he had to act fast, but he still did not have a weapon. He looked around and saw the body of a dead enemy soldier. He ran over, grabbed the soldier's rifle, and began sprinting toward the 2 pinned down men. As Roy ran toward the 2 men, he fired the rifle wildly in all directions to suppress the enemy fire. He was dodging a wall of bullets, and just as he got close to the 2-man team, an enemy bullet tore clean through his thigh. The impact was painful, but Roy did not let it slow him down. He reached the 2 men and told them they had to move. He stood back up, ignoring the gaping wound in his leg, and began firing in both directions to cover them. He ordered the 2 men to crawl back toward the main group while he stood his ground, drawing all the enemy fire to himself. He kept shooting until both men had safely made it back to the main perimeter. Once they were secure, Roy ran the gauntlet once again, limping heavily and bleeding from his thigh, until he rejoined the group. Now that Roy had accounted for all the living members of the team and had moved them to the relatively safer area, he knew it was time to call in the rescue helicopter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a smoke grenade. He threw it into the small clearing he had located earlier. A thick cloud of colored smoke began to rise through the trees. The helicopter pilot, who had dropped Roy off earlier, had not actually abandoned him. He had flown a short distance away to escape the heaviest fire, but he had remained in the area, waiting for a signal. When he saw the colored smoke rising from the clearing, he immediately guided the helicopter back into the danger zone. As the helicopter descended, enemy bullets began to rain down on it, pinging loudly off the metal sides. Despite the intense danger, the pilot held the helicopter steady and touched down in the tiny clearing. Roy immediately began coordinating the evacuation. The members of the team who were still able to move began making their way toward the open doors of the helicopter. Roy knew he needed to provide cover for them, so he began running around the perimeter, picking up discarded rifles from the ground and firing at the advancing enemy. He would empty a magazine, drop the gun, run to another spot, pick up another rifle, and keep shooting. He was a one-man army, doing everything in his power to keep the enemy from shooting down the helicopter while his men climbed aboard. Once Roy saw that most of the surviving men had safely boarded the helicopter, he realized he had a brief window of opportunity. He did not want to leave anyone behind, including the men who had already died in the battle. Roy made the decision to run back into the jungle to retrieve the bodies of his fallen teammates. He grabbed 2 rifles off the ground and ran back into the heavy gunfire. He was shooting with both hands, trying to keep the enemy at bay as he searched the thick brush. He eventually found the body of one of his closest friends, a soldier named Leroy Wright. Roy dropped his weapons, grabbed Leroy, and began the incredibly difficult task of hauling him back toward the helicopter. As he was dragging his friend's body through the dirt, an enemy bullet struck Roy directly in the stomach. The pain was blinding, and he struggled to stay on his feet. He tried to keep moving, but suddenly an enemy grenade detonated right behind him. The blast sent hot shrapnel tearing into his back and legs once again, and the sheer force of the explosion knocked him completely unconscious. He fell to the ground next to his friend, and everything went dark. When Roy finally opened his eyes, he was lying in the dirt, and his body was in absolute agony. He looked around and saw that the situation had gotten even worse. Through the trees, he could see dozens of enemy soldiers running toward his position. He realized that if he tried to carry Leroy's body back to the helicopter now, it would be a suicide mission, and he would be killed before he could reach it. He had no choice but to temporarily leave his friend behind. Roy forced himself to stand up, his body screaming in pain from the multiple gunshot and shrapnel wounds. He began running a wild zigzag pattern through the jungle, dodging bullets as he made his way back to the clearing where the helicopter was waiting. But when he finally broke through the trees and expected to see the helicopter taking off, he was met with a horrifying sight. The helicopter had not escaped. It had been hit by a massive amount of enemy fire while Roy was unconscious, and it had crashed hard onto the ground. The wreckage was now engulfed in bright orange flames and thick black smoke. The pilot had been killed instantly in the crash, but some of the wounded men Roy had just rescued were still alive inside the burning fuselage. They were trapped and unable to escape the fire. Without a single moment of hesitation, Roy ran directly toward the burning helicopter. He plunged into the intense heat and flames, grabbing the survivors one by one and pulling them out of the burning wreckage. He dragged them away from the fire and began moving them to a new defensive position further away in the jungle. He knew that the crash would attract even more enemy attention, and he needed to get them behind cover before the enemy began targeting the crash site with mortars. Roy managed to get all of the survivors to a new, relatively secure area, but as he looked around, he knew they were in extreme danger. There were hundreds of enemy fighters closing in, and the gunfire was relentless. Roy was running on pure adrenaline. His body was covered in blood, and he had multiple bullet wounds, but his mind was still completely focused on keeping his men alive. He realized they were about to be completely overrun, and their only option left was to call in a danger-close airstrike. Roy pulled out his map with shaking, bloody hands. He calmly located his coordinates, keyed his radio, and called the aircraft hovering overhead. He gave them his position and requested an immediate strike. A short time later, the sky filled with the roar of jet engines. Roy watched as a beautiful precision napalm strike hit the jungle floor just yards away from his position. The intense heat washed over them, but the fire did not touch his men. It completely incinerated the enemy forces that were advancing. Roy did not stop there. He continued to coordinate with the pilots, calling in multiple gun runs that shredded the enemy lines while leaving his own team untouched. For a short time, the airstrikes succeeded in keeping the enemy at bay. But eventually, the aircraft had to leave. The enemy immediately renewed their attack, and Roy was shot in his other leg. Believing they were about to be overrun, Roy crawled to each of his teammates and gave them a final shot of morphine to ease their pain. Suddenly, another rescue helicopter arrived, opening fire on the enemy. Roy dragged himself up once again and began carrying his teammates over to the helicopter. After he got the last of the survivors on board, he turned and saw 2 more teammates who had fallen down further back in the trees. He ran to help them, but an enemy soldier jumped out of the brush and hit Roy in the chest with his rifle butt, fracturing his skull and breaking his jaw. The soldier then stabbed Roy repeatedly with his bayonet. Roy managed to grab the bayonet, pull it out of himself, and kill the soldier with his Bowie knife. He then dragged the 2 remaining men to the helicopter, shooting 2 more enemy soldiers along the way. Roy was the last man to climb aboard as the helicopter lifted off into the sky, leaving the blood-soaked jungle behind. During the long helicopter ride back to the base, Roy was in absolutely horrific physical shape. He was bleeding profusely from dozens of separate wounds, and his abdomen had been sliced open so badly by the bayonet that he had to use his own hands to physically hold his intestines inside his stomach. He was completely silent, unable to move or speak, operating only on the absolute last remnants of his willpower. When the helicopter finally touched down at the medical base, the doctors and nurses rushed forward to unload the casualties. When they lifted Roy off the aircraft, they saw a body that was completely destroyed. Roy had a total of 37 separate wounds on his body, including multiple gunshot entry and exit wounds, deep bayonet punctures, and countless pieces of shrapnel embedded in his flesh. The medical staff checked for a pulse, but they could not find one. They listened for a heartbeat, but there was only silence. Roy was not breathing, and his body was cold. Believing there was absolutely nothing they could do, the doctors officially declared Roy Benavidez dead on the spot. His body was placed inside a heavy rubber body bag, and a doctor began to zip it closed. But Roy was actually still conscious. He was completely paralyzed by shock and blood loss, and he could not speak because his jaw had been shattered by the rifle butt. His eyes were also completely sealed shut by the dried blood that had poured down his face. He knew that if he did not find a way to let them know he was alive, he would be buried alive in that body bag. As the doctor pulled the zipper up toward his face, Roy gathered every single ounce of strength left in his body. He forced a small amount of saliva into his mouth and spit directly into the doctor's face. The doctor stopped zipping the bag in complete shock. He wiped his face, realized what had happened, and immediately ordered the medical team to get Roy out of the bag and onto an operating table. Unbelievably, Roy Benavidez had survived. He was prepped for emergency surgery, and once stabilized, he was flown to Japan for intensive care. After spending some time there, he was transferred to a military hospital in Texas, where he spent a year rehabbing from his severe injuries. Roy was immediately given the Distinguished Service Cross and was put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the military's highest award for valor. However, the paperwork took a very long time to be approved by the Department of Defense. Roy was not actually given the Congressional Medal of Honor until 1981, when President Ronald Reagan finally presented it to him during a special White House ceremony. Of the 12 men that were trapped in that jungle, 8 would survive, all thanks to Roy Benavidez. Roy passed away in 1998 as a result of complications from diabetes. He was 63 years old. His story of sheer survival and ultimate loyalty remains one of the most incredible tales of human determination ever told. He proved that even when the situation is completely hopeless, the human spirit can overcome any obstacle. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.